The sky above Willow Creek darkened to an ominous slate gray as thunder rumbled in the distance. Margaret Sullivan stood at the schoolhouse window, watching the approaching storm with growing concern. The weather had turned suddenly, as it often did in Colorado territory, blue skies giving way to threatening clouds within a matter of hours. "Children," she called, turning from the window to face her students, "I think we should end our lessons early today." 20 faces looked up at her from their desks, expressions ranging from relief to worry. At 8 years old, Jimmy Brennan was already showing signs of his father's weather wisdom. "Miss Sullivan," he said, raising his hand even as he spoke, "Pa says this one's going to be a whopper. Says the cattle are huddled together tighter than biscuits in a pan." Maggie nodded, offering a reassuring smile despite her own unease. "Your father has good instincts, Jimmy, which is why I want all of you to gather your things quickly and head straight home." A jagged flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder that rattled the schoolhouse windows. Several of the younger children gasped. "No dawdling," Maggie added with gentle firmness. "Put away your readers and slates. Be sure to stay together with your siblings." She moved efficiently through the room, helping the smallest children with their belongings, all the while keeping one eye on the darkening world outside. The wind had picked up considerably, bending the tops of the pine trees that surrounded the schoolyard. As the last child departed, promising to run straight home, Maggie closed the door against the rising gale. Rather than leaving immediately, she moved to her desk, determined to grade at least a few of the essays her older students had submitted. The storm might pass quickly, and she had nowhere particular to be to. That was the painful truth of her life in Willow Creek. She had a place but not a home, a role but not a family. For 3 years, she had been Miss Sullivan to her students and the school teacher from Boston to everyone else. Respected, certainly, perhaps even liked, but fundamentally alone. Maggie had come west after losing Daniel in the war, seeking distance from the memories that haunted every street corner in Boston. The small frontier town had offered her a teaching position and a chance to be useful, to shape young minds in a place where education was a precious commodity. It hadn't offered healing, exactly, but it had provided purpose. Thunder crashed overhead, closer now. Maggie startled, her pen leaving an ink blot on Emily Henderson's otherwise immaculate essay. With a sigh, she set down her pen and gathered the papers into her satchel. The storm was worsening. Perhaps it was time to return to her boarding room at Mrs. Patterson's house after all. Just as she stood, a blinding flash filled the schoolhouse, accompanied by a deafening crack that seemed to split the world in two. The building shook and Maggie instinctively ducked beneath her desk. When she emerged moments later, the acrid smell of burning wood filled her nostrils. Fire. Looking through the window, she saw flames engulfing the massive pine that had stood beside the schoolhouse for decades. The lightning had struck with deadly accuracy, and the dry summer had turned the old tree into perfect kindling. Already, burning branches were falling dangerously close to the schoolhouse roof. Maggie's heart raced as she assessed her situation. The schoolhouse was in danger, and she needed to salvage what she could before the flames spread. The children's primers could be replaced, as could the maps and chalk. But there was one thing in this building that was irreplaceable. Moving quickly to the small storage cupboard behind her desk, Maggie retrieved a polished wooden box about the size of a large book. Daniel's letters were inside, along with his regiment insignia and the simple gold band he had given her before marching off to Gettysburg. These mementos were all she had left of the man she had planned to marry, the future she had lost. As she clutched the box to her chest, a burning branch crashed through one of the schoolhouse windows, sending glass shards and embers across the wooden floor. There was no more time. Maggie grabbed her satchel, tucked the box securely under her arm, and ran for the door. Outside, the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Rain had begun to fall, but not heavily enough to counter the spreading fire. Maggie hesitated only long enough to make sure the flames hadn't reached the neighboring structures before turning toward Mrs. Patterson's boarding house on the other side of town. The 3-block journey felt endless as the storm intensified around her. Rain fell in cold, heavy drops, soaking through her shawl and cotton dress within minutes. The wind tore at her carefully pinned hair until it hung in sodden waves around her shoulders. Lightning continued to flash overhead, each bolt followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. By the time Maggie reached the boarding house, She was drenched and shivering. She stumbled up the front steps, her box of treasures still clutched protectively to her chest, and pushed open the door. "Good heavens, Miss Sullivan!" Mrs. Patterson exclaimed, hurrying toward her from the parlor. "You're soaked to the bone. Come in by the fire." The older woman helped Maggie remove her dripping shawl and led her to the parlor fireplace, all the while clucking with motherly concern. "We'd begun to worry about you, Mr. Patterson was just saying he ought to check the schoolhouse when this dreadful storm let up a bit." "The schoolhouse," Maggie said, suddenly remembering. "Mrs. Patterson, lightning struck the old pine. There's a fire. I don't think—" "Merciful heavens," Mrs. Patterson pressed a hand to her chest. "Edgar," she called to her husband. "Edgar, there's a fire at the schoolhouse. You must alert the town." As Mr. Patterson hurried out into the storm, Maggie sank into a chair by the fire, still holding her wooden box. The enormity of what had just happened was beginning to settle over her. If she had left when the children did, the schoolhouse might have burned to the ground with no one the wiser until morning. "You're trembling, my dear," Mrs. Patterson observed, bringing a blanket to wrap around Maggie's shoulders. "Let me make you some tea, and you should change out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." Maggie nodded gratefully and rose to climb the narrow stairs to her small room on the second floor. As she reached the landing, however, she heard an alarming sound from above, a groaning, splintering noise that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She had just enough time to step back before a torrent of water burst through the ceiling, followed by a section of the roof itself. Wooden beams, shingles, and plaster crashed down where she had been standing moments before, bringing with them the full fury of the storm. "Miss Sullivan!" Mrs. Patterson cried from below. "Are you hurt?" "I'm all right," Maggie called back, though her voice shook. "But the roof! Stay where you are. Edgar will be back any moment." But Maggie could already see that her situation was dire. Through the gaping hole above, she could see the storm clouds churning. Rain poured in relentlessly, rapidly flooding the upper floor. And beyond her room, where the collapse had begun, she could see open sky where the roof should have been. When Mr. Patterson returned with several townsmen a few minutes later, his assessment was grim. "Holy's side of the roof's given way," he informed his wife and Maggie, water dripping from his beard. "Been worried about those timbers since spring. The men are setting up tarps where they can, but—" He shook his head. "I'm afraid your room is gone, Miss Sullivan, along with most of your belongings, I'd wager." Maggie clutched her wooden box tighter. "Is there another room available? Perhaps just temporarily?" Mrs. Patterson exchanged a look with her husband before turning sympathetic eyes to Maggie. "I'm afraid not, my dear. Every room is taken, what with the cattle buyers in town this week." "Perhaps Mrs. Henderson would have space," Mr. Patterson suggested, though his tone lacked conviction. Maggie knew it was unlikely. Willow Creek was a small town with limited accommodations, and Mrs. Henderson's boarding house catered primarily to men passing through on business. "I could try the church," she said, thinking aloud. "Reverend Phillips might allow me to stay in the vestry for a night or two." "In this storm? It's nearly half a mile to the church, and the creek will be rising," Mrs. Patterson protested. "No, you must stay here tonight. We'll make a pallet in the parlor." Before Maggie could respond, a tremendous crash shook the house, followed by the sound of rushing water from above. "That's another section gone," Mr. Patterson said grimly. "Everyone out. Now, this whole place could come down." The next few minutes passed in a blur as the Pattersons and their boarders evacuated the house. Standing in the rain once more, watching as men struggled to secure tarps over what remained of the boarding house roof, Maggie felt a wave of despair wash over her. In the space of an hour, she had lost nearly everything: her classroom, her lodgings, her few personal possessions. All that remained were the clothes on her back, her satchel with the student essays, and Daniel's box. The practical part of her mind knew she should be grateful to be alive, but the woman in her wanted nothing more than to sink to her knees in the mud and weep. "Miss Sullivan," Mrs. Patterson appeared at her elbow, her own shawl now as sodden as Maggie's had been. "The Hendersons have no room, nor do the Wilsons. The Brennans have offered their barn, but with their 5 children." Maggie nodded, understanding the unspoken conclusion. A school teacher needed to maintain certain standards of propriety. Sleeping in a family's barn, even in an emergency, could raise eyebrows. "The church, then," she said, squaring her shoulders. "I'll make my way there." In this, alone? Mrs. Patterson looked aghast. My dear, the creek will be over its banks by now. You'd never make it across safely. As if to emphasize her point, lightning flashed again, illuminating the town and the swollen creek that cut through its center. The normally placid stream had transformed into a churning, muddy torrent that had already spilled beyond its boundaries. There must be somewhere, Maggie said, desperation creeping into her voice. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then lowered her voice. There is one possibility. Ethan Calloway's place. The rancher? Out past the creek? Maggie had seen Calloway in town occasionally, a tall, broad-shouldered man who kept to himself and spoke little. The children mentioned him sometimes, usually in whispers about how he lived alone in a big cabin he'd built himself, with no family and few visitors. It's closer than the church, and on this side of the creek, Mrs. Patterson continued, and Mr. Calloway is, well, he's a solitary man, but I've never known him to turn away someone in need. The suggestion carried obvious risks. An unmarried woman seeking shelter with an unmarried man, even in an emergency, could damage her reputation beyond repair. As the town's teacher, Maggie was held to the highest moral standards. A scandal could cost her position, her livelihood, her place in the community. But as another crash sounded from the boarding house and the rain intensified, practicality won out over propriety. How do I find his place? She asked. The journey to Calloway's ranch was a nightmare Maggie knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the dirt road to mud that sucked at her boots with every step. The wind tore at her clothing and stung her face with debris and icy droplets. Lightning continued to flash, each bolt making her flinch as she recalled the schoolhouse pine exploding into flames. Worst of all was the crossing at Miller's Creek. The normally shallow stream had swollen to 3 times its usual width, flooding the simple wooden footbridge that connected the town to the outlying farms and ranches. Maggie stood at the water's edge, watching the churning current sweep branches and debris downstream at an alarming rate. She could turn back, return to town, and throw herself on the mercy of the church or one of the families with whom she had less personal connection. But that would mean crossing the main creek, which was even more dangerous now. And the prospect of arriving on a stranger's doorstep, bedraggled and desperate, filled her with dread. No, forward was her only real option. The footbridge was still visible, though partially submerged. If she was careful, if she moved quickly, taking a deep breath, Maggie secured her satchel and Daniel's box beneath her shawl, tucking them against her body as best she could. Then she stepped onto the bridge. The wood was slick beneath her boots, and the current pulled at her skirts with frightening strength. She moved slowly, testing each board before committing her weight to it. Halfway across, a section of the bridge lurched beneath her feet. Maggie gasped, fighting to maintain her balance as water surged around her ankles. 3 more steps, she told herself. Just 3 more. She managed 2 before disaster struck. A massive branch, carried by the floodwaters, slammed into the bridge just ahead of her. The already weakened structure gave way with a splintering crack, and suddenly Maggie was falling, the world tilting crazily around her as she plunged into the icy water. The current caught her immediately, tumbling her over and over. She fought desperately to keep her head above water, but her sodden clothing dragged her down. The cold stole her breath and numbed her limbs within seconds. Daniel's box, she thought frantically. Her satchel was gone, torn away by the current, but somehow she still clutched the wooden box to her chest with one arm while the other flailed for purchase. Through the roaring in her ears, Maggie heard a distant shout. Then strong hands were gripping her arm, pulling her against the current. She was being dragged toward the bank, her rescuer fighting the water's power with every step. As her knees scraped bottom, Maggie found enough strength to help scramble up the muddy bank. She collapsed on solid ground, coughing and gasping, still clutching Daniel's box, though her fingers were numb and blue with cold. "Can you stand?" A deep voice cut through the storm's noise. A man's voice, rough-edged but not unkind. Maggie looked up through strands of soaking hair to see Ethan Calloway kneeling beside her, his own clothes plastered to his powerful frame by the rain. His face was partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could make out a strong jaw darkened by stubble and eyes that assessed her condition with professional intensity. "I think so," she managed, though her teeth had begun to chatter violently. Calloway helped her to her feet, his grip firm but careful. When her legs buckled, he caught her easily. "You're the school teacher," he said, not a question. "Miss Sullivan." She nodded, surprised he knew her name. They had never been formally introduced. "My place is just up the hill," he continued. "Can you walk, or do I need to carry you?" Pride made her want to insist she could walk, but reason prevailed. She was dangerously cold, her limbs leaden and unresponsive. "I don't think I can walk," she admitted through chattering teeth. Without further discussion, Calloway scooped her into his arms. Maggie clutched Daniel's box to her chest with one hand and gripped Calloway's shoulder with the other. Under different circumstances, she might have been mortified by such intimate contact with a man she barely knew. Now she was simply grateful for his warmth and strength as he carried her up the muddy path toward the lights of a cabin nestled among the pines. The cabin was larger than Maggie had expected, not the rough bachelor's shelter she had imagined, but a solidly built home with a covered porch and glass windows that glowed with welcoming lamplight. As Calloway carried her up the steps, she noticed details that spoke of care and craftsmanship. The carved railings, the smooth plank floor of the porch, the sturdy door with its iron hinges. Inside, warmth enveloped her immediately. A fire blazed in a large stone fireplace, casting flickering light over a main room that was both functional and unexpectedly comfortable. Calloway set her down gently in a chair by the fire, then moved with surprising efficiency to stoke the flames higher. "You need dry clothes," he said, his back to her as he added another log to the fire, "and something hot to drink. You're showing signs of exposure." His matter-of-fact tone caught Maggie's attention through her misery. It wasn't the voice of a concerned rancher, but that of someone accustomed to assessing medical conditions. Before she could dwell on this observation, however, Calloway had disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a stack of clothing and a thick woolen blanket. "These belonged to my mother," he said, placing the items beside her. "They'll be too large, but they're dry. I'll make tea while you change." With that, he turned toward what appeared to be a kitchen area, giving her privacy without leaving the room entirely. A compromise between propriety and practicality that Maggie appreciated in her current state. Her fingers were still numb, making the simple act of unbuttoning her sodden dress nearly impossible. She fumbled with the fastenings, frustration mounting until tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. "Let me help." Calloway had returned with a steaming cup. Setting it aside, he knelt before her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as they worked the buttons free. Under normal circumstances, Maggie would have been scandalized by such intimacy with a stranger. But there was nothing suggestive in his manner, only the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. "You were a doctor," she said suddenly, the realization clicking into place. "During the war." His hands paused briefly before continuing their work. "Army surgeon," he confirmed, his voice neutral. "5th Regiment, Pennsylvania Volunteers." "I thought you were a rancher." "I am now." He finished with the buttons and rose to his feet. "Can you manage the rest?" Maggie nodded, clutching the front of her dress closed. "Thank you." He turned away again, moving to the far side of the room where he busied himself with something she couldn't see. Maggie quickly stripped off her soaking dress, petticoat, and stockings, setting them in a soggy pile on the floor. The dry clothing Calloway had provided, a simple cotton nightgown and woolen stockings, felt like heaven against her chilled skin. She wrapped the blanket around herself for additional warmth and modesty before speaking again. "I'm decent now." Calloway turned back, giving her a brief appraising look that remained strictly professional. He retrieved the cup of tea and brought it to her, along with a small glass of amber liquid. "Drink the whiskey first," he instructed. "Just a sip. It'll help warm you from the inside." Maggie hesitated. She had never touched spirits in her life. Daniel had been a temperance advocate, and as a teacher, she was expected to exemplify moral virtues. "It's medicinal," Calloway added, seeming to read her thoughts. "I'm not trying to corrupt the town school teacher." There was the faintest hint of dry humor in his voice that made Maggie look up sharply. His expression remained serious, but something in his eyes, a momentary warmth perhaps, suggested he was not as stern as his reputation implied. She took the glass and sipped cautiously. The liquor burned a fiery trail down her throat, but almost immediately, a welcome warmth began to spread through her chest. "The tea now," Calloway directed, taking back the whiskey glass, slowly. As Maggie sipped the hot, sweet tea, Calloway knelt to examine her leg. She had been vaguely aware of pain there, but had attributed it to the general misery of her condition. Now, as he gently pushed back the blanket to reveal her ankle and calf, she saw an angry gash running from her ankle halfway up her shin. "You're hurt," she said stupidly, surprised by the sight of her own injury. "This happened in the creek," he said, not looking up as his fingers carefully probed the area around the wound. "Probably struck a submerged branch or rock. The cold numbed it, but it'll start hurting soon." As if on cue, the injury began to throb painfully. Maggie bit her lip to keep from crying out. "It needs cleaning and stitches," Calloway continued. "Do I have your permission?" The question, asked with such formal courtesy under the circumstances, almost made Maggie laugh despite her pain. Here she was, half drowned, sitting in a strange man's home, wearing his dead mother's nightgown, with no alternative shelter in the middle of a raging storm. What choice did she have? Yet the fact that he had asked, that he respected her autonomy even now, told her something important about Ethan Calloway. "Yes," she said, "you have my permission." He nodded once, then rose and walked to a cabinet against the far wall. When he returned, he carried a leather satchel that he opened to reveal a collection of medical instruments, scalpels, forceps, needles, and thread, all meticulously maintained. "This will hurt," he warned as he cleaned his hands in a basin of water. "I don't keep chloroform or ether here. I can offer you more whiskey or a piece of leather to bite down on." Maggie swallowed hard. "The whiskey, please." He handed her the glass again, this time not restricting her to a sip. As she drank more deeply, he prepared his instruments, working with the quick, sure movements of someone who had performed these actions countless times. The pain, when it came, was intense despite the whiskey's dulling effect. Maggie gripped the arms of the chair until her knuckles whitened, determined not to cry out. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes as Calloway methodically cleaned the wound, removing bits of debris before beginning to stitch the edges together. To distract herself, Maggie looked around the cabin more carefully. The main room was larger than her entire boarding house accommodation had been, with the stone fireplace as its central feature. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled not with the few volumes she might have expected a rancher to own, but with dozens of books, their spines showing evidence of frequent handling. Nearby stood a small table with a chess set laid out, the pieces carved from what appeared to be local wood, some dark, some light. The furniture was simple but beautifully crafted. A rocking chair near the fire, a dining table with 4 chairs, though Calloway presumably lived alone, comfortable-looking armchairs, including the one in which he now sat. Most surprising was a quilt draped over the back of the sofa, not the rough blanket she might have expected, but an intricate pattern of blues and greens that showed remarkable craftsmanship. "You made that," she said suddenly, gesturing toward the quilt with her free hand. Calloway glanced up briefly from his work. "Yes. It's beautiful." He didn't respond, but she thought she detected a slight softening around his eyes before he returned his attention to her injury. The stitching seemed to take hours, though in reality it was probably no more than 20 minutes. By the time Calloway tied off the final suture, Maggie was lightheaded from pain and whiskey. "Done," he said, applying a clean bandage to the wound. "You should stay off it as much as possible for the next few days. The stitches can come out in about a week if it heals well." "Thank you," Maggie said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." "I didn't find you," Calloway corrected, packing away his medical supplies. "I heard the bridge collapse and went to investigate. Lucky timing." But Maggie wasn't so sure it was luck. Something about the way he had appeared exactly when needed, the professional efficiency with which he had assessed and treated her condition, suggested a man who was habitually vigilant, always prepared for emergencies. "You maintain your medical supplies," she observed, "even though you are not practicing anymore." Calloway closed his satchel with a decisive click. "Old habits." He stood, taking the bag back to its cabinet. "Are you hungry?" The abrupt change of subject told Maggie she had touched on something he preferred not to discuss. She decided not to press, especially given her vulnerable position. "Yes," she admitted. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." He nodded and moved to the kitchen area, where he began preparing a simple meal with the same quiet efficiency he had shown in treating her wound. As he worked, Maggie found her eyelids growing heavy, the combination of emotional shock, physical trauma, and whiskey taking its toll. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Calloway was gently shaking her shoulder. "Miss Sullivan, the food is ready." Maggie blinked, disoriented for a moment before the events of the evening came rushing back. She straightened in the chair, wincing as pain shot through her injured leg. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." "Your body needs rest." Calloway helped her to stand, supporting her weight as he guided her to the dining table where he had laid out a simple but hearty meal of bread, cheese, and what smelled like venison stew. "But you need to eat first." The food was surprisingly good. The bread freshly baked, the stew rich and flavorful. Maggie hadn't realized how hungry she was until she began eating. For several minutes, they ate in silence, the storm continuing to rage outside. "The schoolhouse," she said finally, setting down her spoon. "There was a fire. Lightning struck the old pine tree beside it." Calloway nodded. "I saw the smoke before the rain got too heavy. The volunteer brigade was heading that way. And Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, the roof collapsed. That's why I was trying to reach your place. Mrs. Patterson suggested it." Maggie hesitated, suddenly aware of how her presence might affect his reputation as well as her own. "I'm sorry to impose on you like this. I had nowhere else to go." "It's not an imposition," he said simply. "I have the space." As if to emphasize his point, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows, followed by a crash of thunder that made Maggie flinch. "You'll stay here tonight," Calloway continued. "Tomorrow, when the storm passes, we can figure out more permanent arrangements." The practical way he addressed the situation. No judgment, no concern about gossip or appearances, just solving the immediate problem, was strangely comforting. Maggie nodded gratefully, then stifled a yawn. "You need sleep," Calloway observed. "You can take my bed. I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly." "You have an injury," he interrupted, "and you're still at risk for fever after being in that creek. The bedroom is warmer and the bed is more comfortable than the sofa." His tone made it clear this was not a point he was willing to debate. Maggie recognized the voice of a doctor used to having his medical directives followed without question. "Thank you," she said instead of arguing. "You're very kind." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or discomfort with the characterization. "It's basic decency," he said dismissively, "nothing more." But as he helped her to the bedroom, a space as thoughtfully arranged as the main room, with a large bed covered in handmade quilts, Maggie thought there was more to Ethan Calloway's actions than basic decency. There was a care in how he had treated her, a gentleness that belied his gruff exterior. The bedroom offered another glimpse into the complexity of the man. A bookshelf here, too, filled with medical texts alongside volumes of poetry and philosophy. A desk with neat stacks of paper and a journal bound in leather. And on the wall, a single-framed photograph of a young woman with gentle eyes and a quiet smile. "Your wife?" Maggie asked before she could stop herself. Calloway, who had been turning down the bed, stilled. "No," he said after a moment. "Elizabeth. We were to be married. She died during a fever outbreak near the end of the war." "I'm sorry," Maggie said softly, understanding the loss reflected in his voice. "I lost someone too. My fiancé, Daniel, at Gettysburg." Calloway nodded once, a simple acknowledgement of shared grief. He finished preparing the bed, then moved to the door. "There are extra blankets in the chest if you get cold," he said. "I'll be in the main room if you need anything." With that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Maggie stood for a moment, taking in the unexpected sanctuary she had found. Then, moving carefully to avoid putting weight on her injured leg, she made her way to the bed and slipped beneath the quilts. The bedding smelled of cedar and something herbal, perhaps the soap Calloway used. It should have felt strange, even improper, to lie in a strange man's bed. But exhaustion and the lingering effects of the whiskey overwhelmed any such concerns. Within minutes, Maggie was asleep, Daniel's wooden box clutched to her chest like a talisman. She dreamed of water, dark and cold, pulling her down into its depths. In the dream, she was searching for something, not Daniel's box, but something else. Something vital she couldn't quite remember. Hands reached for her, some trying to save her, others seeking to drag her deeper. She heard voices calling her name, Daniel's voice, and another she didn't recognize, urgent and commanding. Miss Sullivan, wake up. The voice penetrated her dream, drawing her back to consciousness. Maggie opened her eyes to find Ethan Calloway standing beside the bed, a lamp in one hand, concern evident in his face. You were calling out in your sleep, he explained, setting the lamp on the bedside table. And you're burning with fever. Maggie became aware of contradictory sensations. Her body felt simultaneously on fire and racked with chills. Her nightgown was damp with sweat, and her head pounded mercilessly. The creek water, Calloway said grimly, placing a cool hand on her forehead, likely infected the wound. I need to check your leg. Maggie nodded weakly, too miserable to protest as he carefully folded back the quilts. The bandage on her leg was stained with fluid, and when Calloway removed it, she could see angry red streaks extending from the wound. I need to clean it again, he said, his voice taking on the clinical detachment she had noted earlier. And you need willow bark tea for the fever. This will be unpleasant, but necessary. Unpleasant proved to be an understatement. The process of reopening and cleaning the infected wound was excruciating, even with more whiskey to dull the pain. Maggie bit down on a folded cloth to keep from screaming as Calloway worked, his hand steady and sure, despite her distress. When it was finally over, she lay exhausted, tears streaming silently down her temples into her hair. Calloway helped her drink the bitter willow bark tea, then gently wiped her face with a cool cloth. Try to rest, he said. I'll be nearby. Through the haze of fever, Maggie reached out and caught his wrist. Daniel, she murmured, only half conscious. The list. You have to tell someone about the list. The soldiers didn't have to die. She saw confusion flicker across Calloway's face before darkness claimed her once more. The fever held her in its grip for what seemed like eternity. Maggie drifted in and out of consciousness, aware sometimes of Calloway's presence as he changed bandages, helped her drink, or bathed her face with cool water. Other times she was lost in delirious dreams where past and present blurred together. In her fevered state, she spoke of things she had never told anyone. Her guilt over encouraging Daniel to enlist. Her growing disillusionment with teaching in a town that seemed more concerned with appearance than substance. Her loneliness and fear that she would never find a place that truly felt like home. And she spoke of the list, Daniel's discovery, shortly before his death, of corruption in the supply chain providing equipment and medicine to Union troops. Names, dates, shipments of substandard goods that had cost lives. Information he had entrusted to her for safekeeping, contained in what appeared to be ordinary love letters, but was actually a coded message meant for investigators in Washington. When Maggie finally emerged from the fever on what she later learned was the third day, she found Calloway sitting in a chair beside the bed, his own face drawn with fatigue. On the bedside table sat Daniel's wooden box, open to reveal not only letters, but a small leather-bound notebook she had kept hidden beneath a false bottom. You know, she said, her voice a dry whisper. Calloway offered her a sip of water before responding. Some of it. You spoke quite a bit during your fever. The rest I pieced together. He gestured toward the box. I wouldn't normally intrude on private correspondence, but you kept mentioning a list and lives at stake. I thought it might be important. Under normal circumstances, Maggie would have been mortified by the invasion of privacy. Now she felt only relief that someone else finally knew. Daniel discovered that a supplier named Augustus Wells was providing substandard medicines and equipment to Union forces. She explained, her voice gaining strength. Watered-down medicines, faulty surgical tools, bandages made of inferior materials. Men died, not just from their wounds, but from infections that shouldn't have been fatal, from tools that broke during operations, from medicines that failed to work as they should. Calloway's expression had gone very still. Wells, he repeated. Augustus Wells? Maggie nodded. He was based in Philadelphia during the war, but Daniel's last letter mentioned he was moving his operations west. That's part of why I came out here. I was hoping to find him, to deliver Daniel's evidence to the proper authorities. Augustus Wells is here, Calloway said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. In Willow Creek. He arrived about 6 months ago. He's bought the bank and several other properties in town. The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. After 3 years of searching, the man responsible for Daniel's death, and the deaths of countless other soldiers, was here in this small frontier town, prospering while the men he had betrayed lay in their graves. "You're certain it's the same man?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Calloway nodded grimly. Wealthy, mid-50s, widowed, originally from Philadelphia. "It fits." He paused, studying her face. "Did you know he's been inquiring about you?" "About me?" Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with her recent fever. "Why would he—" "I don't know," Calloway admitted, "but he's been asking questions around town. How long you've been here, where you came from, whether you have family connections." A new fear gripped Maggie's heart. What if Wells somehow knew about Daniel's evidence? What if he suspected she had it? She had been careful using her mother's maiden name when she came west, never mentioning her connection to Daniel. But if Wells had resources, if he had been looking for her— "I need to get this information to the federal authorities," she said, struggling to sit up despite her weakness. "Before Wells discovers I have it." Calloway placed a restraining hand on her shoulder. "You're in no condition to go anywhere. The infection is under control, but you're still weak and your leg needs time to heal." "But if Wells finds out, he won't," Calloway assured her. "Not from me, and not from you as long as you remain here until you're stronger." The implications of his statement slowly registered. "You're offering to let me stay, even knowing the danger?" A shadow crossed his face, especially knowing the danger. "Augustus Wells has blood on his hands, more than you know." His gaze drifted to the photograph of Elizabeth on the wall. "Your fiancé wasn't the only one who died because of his greed." Understanding dawned as Maggie looked between Calloway and the photograph. "Elizabeth," she breathed. "She died because of Wells's supplies?" Calloway's jaw tightened. "She was a nurse. The hospital where she worked received a shipment of what was supposed to be quinine for treating fever patients. It was mostly chalk powder with just enough actual medicine to pass a cursory inspection. 24 patients died, Elizabeth among them, before anyone realized. The connection between them, this shared link to a man who had profited from death and suffering, felt significant in ways Maggie couldn't fully articulate. It was as if the storm that had driven her to Calloway's door had been not just a random act of nature, but something more purposeful. "We need to stop him," she said softly. Calloway met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a resolve that matched her own. "Yes," he agreed, "we do. But first you need to heal." As the rain continued to fall outside, gentler now than during the height of the storm, Maggie felt something she had not experienced in 3 long years. The stirring of purpose, of righteous anger, and beneath it all, the faint but unmistakable flicker of hope. The next morning brought clear skies, and the full realization of how completely the storm had transformed Maggie's life. News arrived via Tom Brennan, who stopped by the cabin to check on her at his wife's insistence. "Schoolhouse is standing," he reported, "but the roof's half gone and there's water damage to most everything inside. School board's meeting to discuss repairs, but it'll be at least a few weeks before teaching can resume." That was difficult enough to hear, but worse news followed. "Mrs. Patterson's place is in bad shape too," Brennan continued. "East side of the house is pretty much destroyed. They're staying with relatives over in Miller's Creek for now." "And my belongings?" Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. Brennan's expression was sympathetic. "Not much survived, Miss Sullivan. Mrs. Patterson salvaged what she could, but with the roof gone and the rain—" He shook his head. "I'm sorry." Sitting in Calloway's armchair, her injured leg propped on a footstool, Maggie tried to absorb this new reality. She had no classroom, no lodgings, and few possessions beyond Daniel's box and the clothes on her back when she'd fled the fire. "The town's talking, of course," Brennan added awkwardly, "about you being here. My Sarah told them it was a matter of life and death, which it surely was from what Calloway says about that leg wound. But you know how people can be." Indeed she did. Small towns thrived on gossip, and an unmarried school teacher staying in a bachelor's home would provide fodder for weeks of speculation, regardless of the circumstances. "Mrs. Harrison is leading the charge," Brennan continued, naming the town's most notorious gossip. "Been to see Reverend Phillips already, expressing her concerns about the moral example being set for the children." Maggie closed her eyes briefly, imagining the damage being done to her reputation with every passing hour. When she opened them again, She found Calloway watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable. "Thank you for the update, Mr. Brennan," she said, forcing a smile. "Please tell your wife I appreciate her defense of my character." After Brennan departed, an uncomfortable silence fell over the cabin. Calloway moved about his daily tasks, stoking the fire, preparing a simple breakfast, checking Maggie's wound with clinical detachment. But there was a tension in his movements that hadn't been there before. "You're worried about your reputation," he said finally, setting a plate of food beside her. It wasn't a question, but Maggie answered anyway. "Yes, but more about my position. If the school board decides my behavior has been improper, they could dismiss me." Calloway considered this as he took a seat across from her. "Even though your presence here was necessitated by a life-threatening emergency?" "Even so, propriety is often more important than practicality in these matters." Maggie picked at her food without much appetite. "I should find alternative lodgings as soon as possible." "With your leg in that condition, where would you go?" It was a fair question. The infection had been contained, but the wound was still healing, and Maggie could barely walk without assistance. The idea of moving to another location, especially one less comfortable and well-equipped than Calloway's cabin, was daunting. "Perhaps the church," she suggested without much conviction, "or one of the families might take me in temporarily." "And subject yourself to constant scrutiny and judgment?" Calloway shook his head. "The damage to your reputation is already done, Miss Sullivan. Moving now won't undo the gossip that's already spreading." His bluntness stung, but Maggie couldn't deny the truth of his words. In the eyes of Willow Creek's more conservative residents, she was already compromised. "What would you suggest then?" she asked, a hint of frustration creeping into her voice. "That I simply accept the ruin of my good name and the likely loss of my position?" Calloway's expression remained maddeningly calm. "I suggest you recover fully before making any decisions. And in the meantime, we consider how to address the larger issue of Augustus Wells." The mention of Wells redirected Maggie's thoughts. He was right, of course. Personal concerns about reputation paled in comparison to bringing a war profiteer to justice. "You said he's been asking about me," she recalled. "Do you think he suspects I have Daniel's evidence?" "It's possible," Calloway admitted, "or he may simply be cautious about newcomers to town. Either way, it's better for you to stay here, where you're less accessible, than to place yourself in a more public setting where he could approach you directly." The logic was sound, but Maggie couldn't help feeling like a prisoner, albeit in a comfortable cell with a surprisingly considerate jailer. "I've never been one to hide from challenges," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "If Wells wants to confront me, perhaps I should let him. Draw him out." Calloway's expression darkened. "That would be extremely dangerous. Wells didn't get where he is by being careless. If he suspects you have evidence against him, he won't hesitate to eliminate the threat." The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. "You think he would harm me?" "I think a man who would knowingly provide defective medical supplies to wounded soldiers would do whatever necessary to protect his interests and freedom." Calloway's gaze was steady, his meaning clear. "We need to be strategic, not reckless." There was wisdom in his caution, Maggie had to admit. And beyond the practical considerations, she found herself not entirely opposed to remaining in Calloway's cabin. Despite the unusual circumstances of their acquaintance, she felt safer here than she had anywhere since leaving Boston 3 years ago. "Very well," she conceded. "I'll stay until my leg heals, but I can't simply hide away forever. Sooner or later, I'll need to face the town and whatever consequences come with my decision." Calloway nodded, seeming satisfied with this compromise. "By then, perhaps we'll have a better plan for dealing with Wells." "Oh, Maggie repeated, struck by the casual way he had included himself in her cause. "You don't have to involve yourself in this. You know, it's my fight." Something like a smile, the first she had seen from him, briefly touched Calloway's lips. "It became my fight the moment Wells moved to Willow Creek," he said. "And certainly the moment you washed up, half drowned, on my doorstep with evidence that could finally bring him to justice." There was a quiet intensity to his words that spoke of long-held grief and anger, emotions Maggie understood all too well. In that moment, she realized they were more alike than different, both damaged by loss, both driven by a sense of justice that had shaped their lives in unexpected ways. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." He acknowledged her gratitude with a slight nod, then rose to clear away the breakfast dishes. As he moved about the cabin, Maggie found herself studying him more carefully than she had before. Ethan Calloway was not what she had expected based on town gossip. The solitary rancher who rarely spoke and never socialized had revealed himself to be educated, skilled, and possessed of unexpected gentleness. The cabin itself told a story at odds with his reputation. The books lining the shelves, the chess set laid out as if awaiting an opponent, the handmade quilts that spoke of patience and artistry. Most intriguing was the contrast between his clinical detachment when treating her wounds and the flashes of emotion she had glimpsed when he spoke of Elizabeth or Wells. It was as if he had deliberately constructed walls around his feelings, allowing only occasional glimpses of the man behind the carefully maintained facade. Maggie's musings were interrupted by a knock at the door, sharp, authoritative, and unexpected. Calloway tensed visibly, motioning for her to remain silent as he moved to answer it. From her position in the armchair, Maggie couldn't see the visitor, but the voice that carried across the threshold sent a chill through her body. "Mr. Calloway," said a cultured male voice, "I hope I'm not intruding. I've come to inquire after Miss Sullivan's condition. I understand she's staying with you following her unfortunate accident." Augustus Wells had found her. Calloway's broad shoulders blocked most of the doorway, his posture radiating tension despite his casual tone. "News travels fast in a small town." "Indeed it does," Wells agreed smoothly, "particularly news of such an unusual arrangement. The school teacher is a person of interest to the entire community. Her welfare concerns us all." The calculated pause, the subtle emphasis on unusual arrangement. Everything about Wells' manner suggested a man accustomed to wielding words as weapons. Maggie fought the urge to shrink deeper into the chair, instead straightening her spine and preparing to face the man responsible for Daniel's death. "Miss Sullivan is recovering from a serious injury," Calloway replied, his voice neutral but firm. "She's not receiving visitors at present." "I see." Wells' tone suggested he saw far more than Calloway might wish. "Perhaps you could convey my best wishes for her swift recovery then, and inform her that as chairman of the school board, I look forward to discussing her future with the school once she's well enough." Chairman of the school board. The revelation hit Maggie like a physical blow. Wells now held power over her livelihood, her position in the community, her entire future in Willow Creek. "I'll pass along your message," Calloway said, his voice betraying nothing of the significance of Wells' words. "Please do." There was a pause, then Wells added, "I understand Miss Sullivan came to us from Boston. I lived in Philadelphia myself before moving west. We might have mutual acquaintances. I look forward to discussing our shared connections when she's recovered." The thinly veiled threat was unmistakable. Wells suspected something, perhaps not the exact nature of Maggie's evidence, but enough to consider her a potential threat. "Good day, Mr. Calloway," Wells concluded. "I trust we'll speak again soon." As the door closed behind the unwelcome visitor, Maggie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Calloway remained at the door for a long moment as if ensuring Wells had truly departed, before turning to face her. "He knows," she whispered, fear and anger warring in her chest. "Or at least suspects." "Yes," Calloway's expression was grim, "and now he's positioned himself to control your future in this town." "Chairman of the school board," Maggie repeated numbly. "When did that happen?" "Recently," Calloway said, moving to take the seat across from her. "He's been buying influence throughout the town, purchasing the bank, acquiring property, making generous donations to various causes. The school board position is just his latest acquisition." The implications were clear. Even if Maggie recovered and found new lodgings, her position at the school now depended on the goodwill of the very man she hoped to expose as a criminal. "What do we do now?" she asked, hating the vulnerability in her voice but unable to suppress it. Calloway studied her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "We need more information," he said finally, "about Wells's current operations, his vulnerabilities, potential allies we might have in town. And we need to secure your evidence somewhere Wells can't find it." "The evidence stays with me, Maggie said firmly, instinctively glancing toward Daniel's box, which now sat on a shelf near her chair. "It's all I have left of Daniel, and it's my responsibility to see it delivered to the proper authorities." "I understand," Calloway said, surprising her with his lack of argument. But we should make copies of the key documents at least. Store them separately as insurance. His practical approach to the problem helped calm Maggie's racing thoughts. This was something tangible she could focus on rather than the looming threat of Wells or the gossip spreading through town. There's just something else we should consider, Calloway added after a moment. A way to address both the issue of your reputation and provide additional protection against Wells. What's that? Maggie asked, curious about his thoughtful expression. Marriage, he said simply. Maggie stared at him, certain she had misheard. I beg your pardon. A marriage of convenience, Calloway clarified, his tone matter-of-fact. It would silence the gossips, secure your position despite Wells' influence, and give you the protection of my name and home while we work to expose him. And the proposal, for that was what it was, however pragmatically presented, left Maggie speechless. Marriage to a man she had known for barely 4 days? The very idea was absurd, improper, utterly contrary to everything she had been raised to believe about such sacred commitments. And yet, there was an undeniable logic to Calloway's suggestion. A marriage, even one based on convenience rather than affection, would indeed address many of their immediate problems. It would provide a socially acceptable explanation for her continued presence in his home. It would place her under his legal protection, making it more difficult for Wells to act against her directly. And it would preserve her standing in the community, possibly even her teaching position once the school reopened. You can't be serious, she said finally, though something in his steady gaze told her he was entirely earnest. I rarely joke, Miss Sullivan, he replied, particularly about matters of such consequence. But marriage, Maggie shook her head, still struggling to process the suggestion. We barely know each other. I know you're brave, intelligent, and committed to justice even at personal cost, Calloway countered. You know I'm trustworthy enough to care for you when injured, respectful of your privacy and autonomy, and share your desire to see Wells answer for his crimes. He paused, then added, in many marriages, people know far less about their partners. The truth of his words was difficult to deny. Many marriages, particularly on the frontier, were indeed based on practical considerations rather than romantic attachment, and there was something compelling about the way Calloway had articulated what he knew of her character, qualities that went beyond the superficial aspects most men might notice. Still, the idea was overwhelming. I need time to consider, she said finally. This is not a decision to be made lightly. Calloway nodded, accepting her response without pressure. Of course, it's merely an option to consider, nothing more. He rose from his chair. Rest now, your body is still healing, and you've had enough shocks for one morning. As he moved away to tend to his daily tasks, Maggie found herself watching him with new awareness. Ethan Calloway as a potential husband was not something she had ever contemplated, yet now the possibility had been introduced. She couldn't help evaluating him in that light. He was handsome in a rugged way, his features strong, and his physique powerful from years of physical labor. His intelligence was evident in his medical knowledge, his well-read mind, his strategic thinking. He had shown himself to be considerate, respectful, and possessed of hidden depths beneath his reserved exterior. Most importantly, perhaps, he understood loss as she did, the particular grief of having a future ripped away just when it seemed most promising. They shared not only a common enemy in Augustus Wells, but a common experience of having loved and lost. Could such shared pain be foundation enough for a marriage, even one begun as a practical arrangement? Maggie wasn't sure, but as she watched Calloway move about the cabin, she found herself not entirely opposed to the possibility of finding out. The storm that had brought her to his door had upended her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. Perhaps this unexpected proposal was simply another aspect of that upheaval, another opportunity to chart a new course she had never anticipated. As the morning sun streamed through the cabin windows, casting warm light across the room Calloway had built with his own hands, Maggie allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to call this place home, to share not just a roof but a purpose with the enigmatic man who had saved her life and now offered her a way forward. It was a dangerous thought, but one she couldn't quite dismiss as the day wore on and the full implications of her new reality continued to unfold around her. Days passed with surprising ease as Maggie adjusted to life in Ethan Calloway's cabin. Her leg was healing well, the infection receding under his skilled care. Each morning he changed her bandages with clinical precision, his touch impersonal yet gentle. Each evening they shared simple but satisfying meals prepared with a competence that continued to surprise her. It was during these quiet evenings that Maggie began to truly know the man behind the town's rumors. "Why quilting?" she asked one night as they sat by the fire, she in the armchair with her injured leg propped on a footstool, he across from her mending a tear in one of his shirts with neat practiced stitches. Calloway glanced up, his expression suggesting surprise at her interest. "My mother taught me," he said after a moment. "She believed everyone should know how to create and repair, regardless of gender." "She sounds like a wise woman." She was. A shadow crossed his face, there and gone so quickly Maggie might have missed it had she not been watching closely. Practical, too. Frontier life requires adaptability. "Is that what brought you west? Adaptability?" His hands stilled, the needle poised mid-stitch. "No," he said finally. "I came west to forget, or at least to try." The quiet admission hung in the air between them, more revealing than any longer explanation might have been. Maggie understood what he didn't say, that like her, he had sought distance from memories too painful to face daily. "Did it work?" she asked softly. Calloway's mouth curved in something too rueful to be called a smile. "No, some things follow you, no matter how far you run." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of wind outside. The storm had passed, but winter was approaching, bringing shorter days and colder nights to the Colorado territory. "Your proposal," Maggie said suddenly, the words emerging before she had fully decided to speak them. "Was it entirely practical, or was there more to it?" Calloway looked up sharply, his eyes meeting hers across the space between them. For a moment she thought he might evade the question or retreat behind the polite distance he typically maintained. Instead, he set aside his mending and considered her with unexpected frankness. "Both, I suppose," he admitted. "The practical advantages are clear. Your reputation, protection from wells, a secure living situation. But I wouldn't have suggested it if I didn't." He paused, seemingly searching for the right words. "If I didn't find your company agreeable." "Agreeable," Maggie repeated, unsure whether to be flattered or amused by such faint praise. "More than agreeable," he amended, a hint of discomfort in his usually composed demeanor. "I've lived alone for a long time, Miss Sullivan, by choice. Yet these past days with you here haven't been the intrusion I might have expected. Quite the opposite, in fact. It was perhaps the most personal statement he had made since their acquaintance began, and Maggie found herself touched by the effort it clearly cost him. Ethan Calloway was not a man accustomed to sharing his feelings. "I've found your company more than agreeable as well," she replied, offering a small smile. "Though I still think marriage is rather an extreme solution to our problems." Something like humor flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps, but frontier life often requires extreme solutions." Before Maggie could respond, a knock sounded at the door, the second unexpected visitor in as many days. Calloway's expression immediately closed, the openness of moments before replaced by guarded alertness as he rose to answer. This time, however, the visitor proved to be friendly. Sarah Brennan stood on the porch, a basket over her arm and concern evident in her kind face. "Mrs. Brennan," Calloway greeted her, stepping aside to allow her entry. "Please come in." "I hope I'm not intruding," Sarah said, moving into the cabin with the comfortable confidence of a woman accustomed to managing a busy household. "I've brought some things for Miss Sullivan, a dress, some undergarments, and a few personal items that might make her more comfortable." Maggie felt a rush of gratitude at the thoughtful gesture. She had been making do with Calloway's mother's nightgown and a spare shirt of his, neither of which was particularly suitable for daytime wear. "Mrs. Brennan, you're an angel," she said warmly as Sarah approached and set the basket beside her chair. "This is incredibly kind of you." "Nonsense," Sarah dismissed with a wave of her hand. "It's the least I could do. The way some people in town are carrying on, you'd think no one had ever suffered misfortune before." She cast a disapproving glance toward the door, as if the gossips of Willow Creek might be lurking just outside. "As if you had any choice but to accept Mr. Calloway's help, with the creek rising and your leg in such a state." The practical defense of Maggie's situation was delivered with such matter-of-fact conviction that she felt tears of gratitude prick at her eyes. After Wells's thinly veiled threats and the knowledge that her reputation was being shredded throughout town, Sarah Brennan's straightforward support was a balm to her spirit. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to fully express her appreciation. Sarah patted her hand. "Now then, I've also brought news. The school board met yesterday to discuss repairs to the schoolhouse." "And?" Maggie asked, tensing slightly at the mention of the board now headed by Augustus Wells. "They've approved funds for rebuilding, but it will take at least a month, possibly longer with winter coming on." Sarah hesitated, glancing briefly at Calloway before continuing. "There was also discussion about your living arrangements. Mr. Wells suggested that perhaps the teaching position should be temporarily filled by someone else until matters are clarified." The diplomatic phrasing didn't disguise the threat to Maggie's position. "I see," she said, working to keep her voice steady. "And what was the board's decision?" "Postponed for now. Reverend Phillips argued that making any such change before you've recovered enough to speak for yourself would be unchristian." Sarah's expression suggested she shared the Reverend's sentiment. "But there will be another meeting next week," and Wells seemed confident of the outcome. Of course he did. Wells had been systematically establishing his influence in Willow Creek, and the school board would be no exception. He would use her situation with Calloway as leverage to remove her from her position, eliminating the threat she posed to his carefully constructed new identity. "Mrs. Brennan," Calloway spoke up, his deep voice drawing both women's attention. "What's your impression of Wells as a newcomer to town?" Sarah considered the question thoughtfully. "He presents himself well, generous with donations, attentive at church, charming to the ladies. But there's something," she frowned slightly, "something calculating in the way he watches people, as if he's always looking for weaknesses." "Has he shown particular interest in anyone besides Miss Sullivan?" "He's been paying court to Widow Carleton," Sarah replied. "She owns the largest parcel of undeveloped land near town, prime location if the railroad comes through, which Wells seems certain it will." Calloway nodded as if this information confirmed something he had already suspected. "And his business dealings? Has your husband mentioned anything unusual?" "Tom says Wells has been buying up loans from farmers who've fallen on hard times. Offering to help, he says, but the terms are strict. Several families are worried they might lose their land if next season isn't better." Sarah's expression sharpened with sudden suspicion. "Why all these questions about Wells? Is there something we should know?" Maggie exchanged a glance with Calloway, silently debating how much to reveal. Sarah Brennan seemed trustworthy, and her husband was respected in the community. Having allies might be crucial in the days ahead. "Mrs. Brennan," Maggie began carefully, "what would you say if I told you Augustus Wells is not the respectable businessman he appears to be?" Sarah's eyebrows rose. "I'd say that confirms my instincts about the man." "What has he done?" Over the next half hour, Maggie shared a carefully edited version of her knowledge about Wells, his history as a war profiteer, the substandard supplies that had cost soldiers lives, his apparent flight west to escape potential prosecution. She did not mention Daniel's evidence specifically, nor the personal connection that drove her determination to see Wells brought to justice. When she finished, Sarah sat in thoughtful silence for a moment. "That explains much about his interest in you," she said finally. "If he suspects you know his past—" "Exactly," Calloway confirmed, "which is why Miss Sullivan's situation is more precarious than mere gossip might suggest." "Then you must marry her," Sarah stated with the simple directness of a frontier woman accustomed to practical solutions. "Today, if possible. Tomorrow at the latest." Maggie blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Brennan, It's the obvious answer," Sarah continued, warming to her subject. "Marriage would silence the gossips, secure your position in the community, and provide protection against whatever Wells might attempt. And it's clear you two are well suited, despite the unusual circumstances of your acquaintance." "Well suited?" Maggie echoed, startled by the assessment. Sarah smiled knowingly. "I've known Ethan Calloway for 3 years, Miss Sullivan. In all that time, he's never allowed anyone into his home for more than the briefest visit, let alone to stay. Yet here you are, not just tolerated, but cared for. And I see the way you look at him when you think no one notices." Heat rose in Maggie's cheeks at the perceptive observation. Had she been so transparent? She risked a glance at Calloway, finding his expression carefully neutral, though a certain tension in his jaw suggested Sarah's words had affected him as well. Marriage is a significant commitment, Maggie said, trying to recover her composure. Even one begun for practical reasons. All marriages begin for practical reasons to some degree, Sarah countered. Affection grows with time and shared purpose. And you already have the latter, don't you? This common cause against Wells? Put that way, the proposition seemed more reasonable than Maggie had initially thought. She and Calloway did share a purpose, and there was undeniably something between them. A connection, a mutual respect, perhaps even the beginning of deeper feelings. I'll leave you to consider it, Sarah said, rising to her feet. But don't take too long. Wells is moving quickly to consolidate his position, and your window of opportunity may be brief. After Sarah departed, a weighted silence fell over the cabin. Maggie busied herself examining the contents of the basket. A simple but well-made dress in deep blue, undergarments, a hairbrush, and other small necessities that suddenly seemed like priceless luxuries. Mittal, Brennan is a practical woman, Calloway observed finally, returning to his chair by the fire. Yes, Maggie agreed, still not meeting his eyes. Very practical. Her assessment of Wells is likely accurate as well. He won't wait long to make his next move against you. Maggie nodded, setting aside the basket to face him directly. Then perhaps we should consider her suggestion more seriously. Calloway's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. You're willing to entertain the idea of marriage? To me? I'm willing to consider all practical options, Maggie replied carefully, including that one. Something shifted in his eyes, disappointment perhaps, but it was gone too quickly for her to be certain. I see, he said, his voice neutral. A business arrangement, then. Isn't that what you proposed initially? A marriage of convenience? Yes, he acknowledged, though Mrs. Brennan seemed to suggest something more might be possible. The implication hung in the air between them, neither willing to address it directly. Maggie found herself studying Calloway's face, noting the strong line of his jaw, the intelligence in his green eyes, the hint of silver at his temples that suggested experiences beyond his years. He was handsome in a rugged way, certainly, but more importantly, he was a man of principle and unexpected depth. If we were to do this, she said slowly, what would you expect? From me, I mean. Calloway considered the question with the careful deliberation she had come to associate with him. Respect, he said finally, honesty, partnership in maintaining this home, and pursuing justice for those harmed by Wells. He paused, then added more quietly, I would not expect or demand the physical aspects of marriage, not unless such intimacy developed naturally between us. The directness of his statement both relieved and oddly disappointed Maggie. Relief because the prospect of immediate physical intimacy with a man she barely knew was daunting. Disappointment because some small part of her had begun to wonder what it might be like to be held by him, to be kissed by those firm lips that so rarely smiled. And you, he asked, what would you expect from such an arrangement? Maggie considered, wanting to be as honest as he had been. Protection, yes, both from Wells and from gossip. The chance to continue teaching once the school reopens. Partnership in bringing Wells to justice. She hesitated, then added, and perhaps, in time, companionship of a sort I haven't had since losing Daniel. Calloway nodded, accepting her terms without comment on the last, more personal admission. Then we have the foundation for an agreement, he said. If you decide this is the path you wish to take. I need time to think, Maggie replied, though in truth her mind was already moving toward acceptance. What alternatives did she really have? Return to a town where her reputation was in tatters and her safety threatened by a man who had already demonstrated his willingness to destroy lives for profit? Flee Willow Creek entirely, abandoning her students and the life she had built over 3 years? Against these options, marriage to Ethan Calloway seemed increasingly reasonable, perhaps even desirable. Of course, he agreed, it's not a decision to be made hastily. Rising from his chair, he moved toward the kitchen area. I'll prepare dinner while you rest. Your leg needs continued care if you are to avoid reopening the wound. As he busied himself with meal preparations, Maggie found her thoughts drifting to what life might be like as Ethan Calloway's wife. Would they continue as they were now, sharing meals and quiet evenings by the fire? Would she eventually move from the bedroom to share his bed, not just for propriety's sake, But because they both desired it? Could affection, even love, grow from such an unusual beginning? Her gaze fell on the chess set positioned on a small table near the window. The pieces stood in their starting positions, as if waiting patiently for players to begin a game. "Do you play?" she asked, gesturing toward the board when Calloway looked up. "Yes," he replied, "though it's been some time since I've had an opponent." "Would you teach me? I know the basic movements, but I've never properly learned strategy." A flicker of genuine pleasure crossed his face, the closest thing to a smile she had yet seen from him. "I'd be happy to." After dinner, he brought the chess set to the small table between their chairs and began explaining the finer points of the game, the importance of controlling the center, the value of developing pieces methodically, the concept of strategic sacrifice for long-term advantage. Maggie found herself absorbed not just in the game, but in the rare animation that came over Calloway as he taught. His usual reserve softened, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before loss and grief had shaped him into the solitary figure Willow Creek knew. "You're a natural teacher," she observed as they reset the board after her inevitable defeat. "Patient and clear in your explanations." He looked momentarily surprised by the compliment. "Teaching was part of my duties as a senior surgeon. Training younger doctors in battlefield conditions requires clarity and patience." "Is that why you became a doctor? Because you enjoyed teaching?" Calloway's hands stilled on the chess pieces. "No," he said after a moment. "I became a doctor because I wanted to help people, to make a difference in a world that often seems indifferent to suffering." A shadow crossed his face. "The war showed me the limits of that ambition." "Because you couldn't save everyone?" Maggie asked gently. His expression turned inward, haunted by memories she could only imagine. "Because I had to choose who to save," he said, his voice dropping to near a whisper. "When supplies ran low, when the wounded kept coming with no end in sight, decisions had to be made. Triage, they called it, a clinical term for playing God." The pain in his voice was raw, a wound that had never properly healed. Maggie found herself reaching across the table to cover his hand with hers, the first time she had initiated physical contact between them. "You did what you could with what you had," she said softly. "The real blame lies with men like Wells, who provided insufficient or defective supplies for their own profit." Calloway looked down at her hand resting on his, then slowly turned his palm upward to clasp her fingers. The gesture was tentative, as if he had forgotten the simple human comfort of touch. "That's why I stopped practicing medicine after Elizabeth died," he admitted. "I couldn't face making those choices anymore. Not when I'd failed to save the person who mattered most to me." "But you haven't stopped entirely," Maggie pointed out. "You treated my wound as skillfully as any doctor I've known. You maintain your medical supplies. You still have the instinct to heal." He was silent for a long moment, his thumb moving absently across the back of her hand in a way that sent a peculiar warmth up Maggie's arm. "Perhaps," he acknowledged finally. "Old habits, as I said before." "Good habits," she countered. "This town could use a doctor, you know." "The nearest one is in Miller's Creek, nearly 20 miles away." Calloway withdrew his hand gently, the moment of unusual openness passing. "One problem at a time, Miss Sullivan. First we deal with Wells. Then we can consider other possibilities." The conversation turned to more immediate concerns. Wells's position on the school board, his interest in the Widow Carleton's land, the pattern of loan acquisitions that Sarah Brennan had mentioned. They were developing a clearer picture of Wells' activities in Willow Creek, though his ultimate purpose beyond escaping his past remained unclear. As the evening wore on, Maggie found herself yawning despite her interest in the discussion. The day had been emotionally taxing and her body was still recovering from injury and infection. "You need rest," Calloway observed, rising to help her from her chair. "Tomorrow we can continue planning." He supported her as she made her way to the bedroom, his arms strong around her waist, careful to keep weight off her injured leg. At the doorway she paused, suddenly reluctant to end their evening. "Mr. Calloway," she began, then hesitated. "Ethan, if we were to marry, I would not expect or demand that you forget Elizabeth, just as I hope you would not expect me to forget Daniel." Surprise registered in his expression, followed by something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps, for her understanding of what Elizabeth's memory meant to him. "Our pasts have shaped us," he said quietly. Denying them would be denying parts of ourselves. Yes, Maggie agreed, but perhaps our futures need not be determined solely by what we've lost. Their eyes held for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then Calloway nodded once and stepped back, allowing her to enter the bedroom alone. "Good night, Margaret," he said, using her full name for the first time. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, finding she liked the sound of his name on her lips. As she prepared for bed, Maggie's mind continued to revolve around the possibility of marriage to Ethan Calloway. What had begun as a purely practical suggestion had begun to take on new dimensions as she learned more about the man behind the reserved exterior. There was depth there and kindness, and perhaps the capacity for something more than the solitary existence he had carved out for himself. By the time she slipped beneath the quilts, Maggie had nearly made her decision. But sleep claimed her before she could fully articulate it even to herself, bringing dreams of chess pieces moving across a board where the stakes were far higher than any game. Morning brought clarity, and with it, resolution. Maggie woke to the familiar sounds of Ethan moving about the cabin, preparing breakfast with the same quiet efficiency he brought to all tasks. The routine had become comforting in its predictability, so different from the chaos that had marked her arrival. Using the brush Sarah had brought, Maggie arranged her hair as neatly as possible, then changed into the blue dress. It fit well enough, though it had clearly been made for someone with a slighter build. Still, after days in borrowed nightgowns and oversized shirts, the simple dress felt like finery. When she emerged from the bedroom, making her way carefully with the aid of a walking stick Ethan had fashioned for her, she found him at the stove, his back to her, as he turned slices of bacon in a cast-iron pan. "Good morning," she said, causing him to glance over his shoulder. He turned fully when he saw her, his expression changing subtly as he took in her transformed appearance. "Good morning," he replied, his voice perhaps a touch lower than usual. "The dress suits you." It was a simple observation, not an elaborate compliment, yet Maggie felt a flush of pleasure at his approval. "Thank you." Mrs. Brennan was very thoughtful. "How was your leg this morning?" he asked, returning to his cooking with seeming casualness, though something in his posture suggested heightened awareness of her presence. "Better," Maggie replied, making her way to the table. "Still painful when I put weight on it, but the infection seems truly gone now." "Good. We'll check the stitches after breakfast. They may be ready to come out." The domestic normalcy of the exchange struck Maggie suddenly. How easily they had fallen into patterns of cohabitation, how natural it felt to discuss such mundane matters with this man who had been a stranger just days ago. Perhaps Sarah Brennan had been right about their compatibility, despite the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. As they ate the simple but satisfying breakfast, Maggie gathered her courage. "I've been thinking about your proposal," she said, setting down her fork to meet his gaze directly. Ethan stilled, his expression carefully neutral. "And?" "I think Mrs. Brennan was right. Marriage would solve several immediate problems and give us time to address the larger issue of Wells." Maggie paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "And I find I'm not opposed to the idea of becoming your wife, even beyond the practical considerations." The careful neutrality in his expression gave way to something more complex, surprise certainly, but also what appeared to be cautious hope. "You're certain?" he asked. "It's a significant commitment, as you said yesterday." "I'm certain that I respect you and feel safe in your presence," Maggie replied honestly. "I'm certain that we work well together and share common purpose. The rest," she smiled slightly. "As Mrs. Brennan suggested, affection can grow with time." Ethan considered her words with characteristic thoroughness. Then, in a gesture that caught Maggie completely by surprise, he rose from his chair and came around the table to kneel beside hers, taking her hand in his. "Margaret Sullivan," he said, his deep voice steady despite the unprecedented formality of his posture. "I offer you my name, my home, and my protection. I promise to respect you as an equal partner and to honor your independence while working alongside you toward justice. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The unexpected ceremony of the moment brought tears to Maggie's eyes. What might have been a merely practical arrangement had been transformed by Ethan's words and actions into something that, while not quite romantic, held genuine dignity and meaning. "Yes," she said simply, "I will." A rare smile transformed Ethan's usually solemn face, softening the lines around his eyes and revealing a glimpse of the younger man he must have been before war and loss had marked him. Still holding her hand, he rose to his feet. Reverend Phillips can perform the ceremony, he said, practicality reasserting itself now that her acceptance was secured. Perhaps tomorrow, if you feel strong enough to make the journey to town. Tomorrow, Maggie agreed, finding herself reluctant to release his hand. That would be best before the school board meets again. The day passed in quiet preparation. Ethan checked Maggie's wound and removed the stitches, declaring the healing satisfactory, though cautioning continued care. He then rode into town to speak with Reverend Phillips and to purchase a few necessities, leaving Maggie alone in the cabin for the first time since her arrival. She used the opportunity to explore more thoroughly, curious about the home that would soon be hers as well. The cabin was larger than it appeared from outside, with a main room, bedroom, and a small study she hadn't yet seen. This last space proved the most revealing about the man she had agreed to marry. The study contained a desk covered with neat stacks of paper, records of the ranch's operations, she presumed, and more bookshelves filled not only with medical texts, but with volumes of history, philosophy, and literature. A detailed map of the territory hung on one wall, with small pins marking locations she didn't recognize. Most telling was a small wooden box on a shelf above the desk. Unlike Daniel's box, which was polished and fitted with a brass lock, this one was roughly carved, its lid secured with a simple leather thong. Maggie hesitated, knowing she was intruding on Ethan's privacy, but her curiosity eventually won out. The box contained letters, as she had expected, presumably from Elizabeth. But beneath them lay something she hadn't anticipated. A journal bound in worn leather, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. The entries were dated from during the war, a medical officer's record of cases treated, procedures performed, and outcomes observed. Maggie knew she should close the journal immediately. These were private records, never intended for her eyes. But a familiar name caught her attention, freezing her in place. May 14, 1863. Private Daniel Winters, 20th Massachusetts, admitted with gunshot wound to left shoulder. Extraction successful but infection setting in. Supplies of carbolic acid exhausted. Utilizing alcohol tincture as substitute. Efficacy unproven. Patient feverish but lucid. Her heart pounding, Maggie read on. May 15, 1863. Winters deteriorating. Wound showing signs of gangrene despite treatment. Surgical intervention necessary but patient weakened by fever. Prognosis poor without proper antiseptics. Requisition for medical supplies unfilled for third consecutive week. May 16, 1863. Performed amputation on Private Winters as last resort. Patient did not survive procedure. Blood loss excessive, condition too weakened by infection. Another casualty of supply shortages. Have written to commanding officer again regarding critical need for basic medical necessities. Maggie's hands trembled as she stared at the pages. Daniel. Her Daniel had been treated by Ethan during the war, had died under his care due to the very supply shortages that Wells had created for profit. The connection was so improbable, so incredible, that she could scarcely believe it. Yet the evidence was before her in Ethan's meticulous handwriting, a record he had kept all these years, perhaps as evidence of his own, against men like Wells who had turned war into opportunity for personal gain. The sound of a horse approaching snapped Maggie back to the present. Hastily, she returned the journal to its place beneath the letters and secured the box as she had found it. By the time Ethan entered the cabin, she was seated by the fire, her expression carefully composed despite the tumult in her mind. Should she tell him what she had discovered? Would it change anything between them? The coincidence seemed too significant to ignore, yet she hesitated to reveal her intrusion into his private records. Reverend Phillips has agreed to perform the ceremony tomorrow at noon, Ethan announced as he set down his purchases. A small bag that presumably contained provisions and a larger package wrapped in brown paper. I've also spoken with Tom Brennan. He and Sarah will serve as witnesses. That's good, Maggie replied, hoping her voice sounded normal. Thank you for arranging everything. If Ethan noticed anything unusual in her manner, he gave no sign of it. Instead, he held out the paper-wrapped package. I bought this in town for tomorrow. Curious, Maggie unwrapped the package to find a length of fine ivory-colored wool, simply but beautifully woven. It's lovely, she said, running her fingers over the soft material. Sarah mentioned she could help you fashion it into a suitable dress for the ceremony, Ethan explained, a hint of uncertainty in his typically confident demeanor. If you wish. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Maggie deeply. This was not the action of a man entering a purely practical arrangement, but of one who wanted his bride, however unexpectedly acquired, to feel valued on their wedding day. Thank you, she said softly. It's perfect. The arrival of Sarah Brennan an hour later provided a welcome distraction from the discovery Maggie was still processing. With characteristic efficiency, Sarah took charge of transforming the wool into a simple but elegant dress, her skilled fingers working quickly as she and Maggie sat by the fire. You've made the right decision, Sarah said as she stitched, her needle flashing in the firelight. Ethan Calloway is a good man despite his solitary ways, and the look on his face when he came to invite Tom to the wedding, I haven't seen him so at peace since I've known him. We barely know each other, Maggie reminded her, though the words felt less true with each passing day. Sarah smiled knowingly. Some people find in a week what others search for all their lives. The circumstances may be unusual, but that doesn't mean the connection isn't real. As she spoke, Ethan entered from outside, bringing an armload of firewood. He nodded politely to Sarah, then set about building up the fire against the evening chill. Maggie found herself watching him. The confident movements, the careful attention to detail, the quiet strength in his tall frame. Whatever else might come of their hasty marriage, she knew she would never fear this man. The question was whether she could truly love him, knowing what she now did about his connection to Daniel's death. The rational part of her mind understood that Ethan was not responsible, that he had done everything possible with the inadequate resources available to him. But emotions rarely followed rational paths, and the discovery had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. There, Sarah said finally, holding up the completed dress. It's simple, but I think it will do nicely for tomorrow. Shall we see if it fits? The dress did fit, needing only minor adjustments at the waist and hem. Standing before the small mirror Ethan had brought from the bedroom, Maggie hardly recognized herself. The ivory wool complemented her dark hair and brought color to cheeks pale from days of convalescence. More than that, there was a different quality to her expression, a determination, a purpose that had been lacking in recent years. You look beautiful, Sarah declared, standing back to admire her handiwork. Ethan won't know what hit him. Maggie smiled at the friendly teasing, but her thoughts remained troubled by her discovery. As Sarah gathered her sewing things to depart, promising to return in the morning to help with final preparations, Maggie made a decision. She could not enter marriage, even one begun for practical reasons, with such a significant secret between them. After Sarah's departure, as Ethan prepared their evening meal, Maggie gathered her courage. Ethan, she began, her voice more tentative than she would have liked. There's something I need to tell you. He turned from the stove, his expression attentive. What is it? While you were in town today, I explored the cabin, including your study. She watched his face carefully as she continued. I found your medical journal from the war, and I read some of it. A stillness came over him, not anger but a kind of watchful waiting. I see, he said, his voice carefully neutral. And? I found an entry about a patient, Private Daniel Winters. Maggie swallowed hard before continuing. My Daniel. Understanding dawned in Ethan's eyes, followed by what looked like genuine regret. Your fiancé was my patient, he said softly. I didn't make the connection until now. You tried to save him, Maggie acknowledged, her voice thick with emotion. The journal makes that clear. You did everything you could with what you had available. It wasn't enough. The simple statement carried years of accumulated guilt. For him or for too many others. Because of men like Wells, Maggie said, the anger she had carried for 3 years rising fresh in her chest. Because they valued profit over lives. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight with suppressed emotion. Does this change things between us? He asked after a moment. Knowing I failed to save the man you loved? The directness of the question demanded equal honesty in return. I don't know, Maggie admitted. It's overwhelming to discover this connection. To know that you were there in Daniel's final moments when I was hundreds of miles away. I understand if you want to reconsider our arrangement, Ethan said, his tone formal once more. the brief openness of the previous evening seemingly forgotten. No, Maggie replied quickly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. If anything, this connection makes our purpose more clear. Together, we can do what neither of us could manage alone. Bring Wells to justice for Daniel, for Elizabeth, for all those who suffered because of his greed. Relief flickered across Ethan's face, though he maintained his careful composure. Then you still wish to proceed with the wedding tomorrow? Yes, Maggie confirmed, but I needed you to know what I discovered. I couldn't begin our marriage with such a secret between us. Ethan crossed the room to stand before her, closer than he had ever voluntarily positioned himself outside of providing medical care. Thank you for your honesty, he said quietly. It's not a quality I've encountered often. Before Maggie could respond, another knock sounded at the door. The third unexpected visitor in 2 days. Ethan's expression immediately shifted to alertness as he moved to answer it. The man who stood on the porch was a stranger to Maggie, tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His clothes were trail-worn, but of good quality, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that suggested military training. Dr. Calloway, the man said, removing his hat. It's been a long time. Ethan stood frozen in the doorway, shock evident in his rigid posture. Lewis, he said finally, his voice strained. What are you doing here? May I come in? The visitor asked, glancing past Ethan to where Maggie sat by the fire. I've traveled a long way to find you, and what I have to say shouldn't be discussed on your doorstep. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan stepped aside to allow the man entry. Margaret, this is James Lewis. We served together during the war. Lewis, this is Margaret Sullivan, He paused, apparently unsure how to introduce her given their current, unusual status. Fiancé, Maggie supplied, curious about this man who had clearly unsettled Ethan. We're to be married tomorrow. Lewis's eyebrows rose slightly, but he offered a polite nod. Congratulations to you both. I apologize for intruding on what must be a happy time. What brings you to Willow Creek? Ethan asked, his tone suggesting the pleasantries were unnecessary between them. Last I heard you were practicing in Chicago. I'm not here as a doctor, Lewis replied, accepting the seat Ethan reluctantly offered. I'm here on behalf of the War Department, specifically an investigation into fraudulent supply contracts during the conflict. Maggie felt her breath catch. Could it be possible? After 3 years of carrying Daniel's evidence, waiting for the right opportunity to present it, had the investigation finally reached Willow Creek independently? You're investigating Augustus Wells, she said, drawing a sharp look from Lewis. You know of him? He asked, surprise evident in his voice. More than know of him, Ethan interjected. He's here in Willow Creek, has been for several months, establishing himself as a respectable businessman and community leader. Lewis leaned forward, intense focus replacing his earlier measured demeanor. You're certain it's the same man, Augustus Wells from Philadelphia? We're certain, Maggie confirmed, and we have evidence of his crimes during the war, records my late fiancé compiled before his death at Gettysburg, showing Wells's company provided substandard medical supplies and equipment to Union forces. For a moment, Lewis appeared speechless. Then he laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. I've been tracking Wells for 2 years, following rumors and false leads across half the country, and you're telling me you not only know where he is, but have evidence against him? Evidence I've been carrying since I left Boston 3 years ago, Maggie confirmed, waiting for the opportunity to present it to the proper authorities. Lewis shook his head in amazement. This is unexpected, fortuitous, but unexpected. He turned to Ethan, his expression growing serious once more. There's something else you should know, Calloway. Something about Elizabeth's death. Ethan went very still. What about it? It wasn't random, Lewis said quietly. She wasn't just another victim of the fever outbreak. She was targeted. Targeted? Ethan repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. What are you saying? Elizabeth was working with us, Lewis explained. She noticed discrepancies in medical supplies before anyone else, realized they were being tampered with, watered down, substituted with inferior materials. She was gathering evidence against Wells and his partners. Maggie watched as the color drained from Ethan's face. You're saying Wells had her killed, he said. Not a question, but a statement of terrible understanding. Lewis nodded grimly. We believe so. Not directly, he was too careful for that. But the hospital ward where she worked received a shipment of particularly contaminated medicines right after she began asking questions. She was one of the first to fall ill. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence. Maggie could see Ethan struggling to process this new information, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing carefully controlled. "You knew this," he said finally, accusation clear in his voice as he stared at Lewis. "You knew, and you never told me." "We couldn't be certain until recently," Lewis replied, meeting Ethan's gaze steadily. "And by then you had disappeared. It took months to track you here." "So Elizabeth died because she was trying to expose Wells," Ethan said, each word precise and cold. "Just as Miss Sullivan's fiancé died because of Wells's fraudulent supplies. And now Wells is here, in Willow Creek, living comfortably while building a new identity for himself." "Not for much longer," Lewis assured him. "With your evidence and what we've gathered, we can finally bring him to justice. But we need to move carefully. Wells has powerful friends, even now." Maggie watched Ethan closely, concerned by the rigid control he was maintaining over his emotions. The discovery that Elizabeth had been deliberately targeted, rather than a random victim of illness, would be devastating for anyone, but for a man who had already shouldered so much guilt and grief, it seemed particularly cruel. "Ethan," she said softly, rising from her chair to move to his side, "this changes everything." He looked down at her, his green eyes dark with suppressed fury and pain. "Yes," he agreed, "it does." Lewis glanced between them, apparently sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "I've taken a room at the hotel in town," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll need to see your evidence, Miss Sullivan, but that can wait until tomorrow. For tonight, I'll leave you to process this information." After Lewis departed, promising to return the following day, silence fell over the cabin. Ethan stood motionless, staring into the fire as if it might contain answers to questions he had carried for years. "I should have known," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Elizabeth was too careful, too skilled to have contracted the fever so quickly. I should have questioned it." "You couldn't have known," Maggie said gently, reaching for his hand. "Wells went to great lengths to cover his tracks." "She was trying to stop him," Ethan continued, as if he hadn't heard her. "While I was focused on treating symptoms, she was trying to address the cause, and it got her killed. And now we have the chance to finish what she started," Maggie reminded him, squeezing his hand. "What Daniel started. Together." Slowly, Ethan's gaze shifted from the fire to her face. The raw pain in his eyes made Maggie's heart ache, but beneath it she could see a determination forming, a purpose that might, with time, help heal the wound that Lewis's revelation had reopened. "Yes," he agreed, his fingers finally closing around hers. "Together." As night settled over the cabin, bringing with it a hushed anticipation of the day to come, Maggie found herself reflecting on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. A storm, a near drowning, an unlikely rescue, each seemingly random event now revealed as part of a pattern leading inexorably toward confrontation with the man who had caused so much suffering. Tomorrow she would become Ethan Calloway's wife. Tomorrow they would begin planning Wells's downfall in earnest, with Lewis's help. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and perhaps new possibilities for healing. But tonight, as she and Ethan sat together by the fire, their hands still joined in silent commitment to their shared cause, Maggie felt something she had not experienced since losing Daniel. A sense of rightness, of purpose, and most surprisingly of all, a fragile but undeniable hope. The morning of Maggie's wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of crystalline autumn day that showcased the Colorado Territory at its finest. Golden aspen leaves shimmered against the deep blue sky, and distant mountains stood sharp and defined on the horizon, their peaks already dusted with early snow. Maggie woke before sunrise, her mind too full of the previous day's revelations to permit further rest. She lay quietly, watching as dawn gradually illuminated the bedroom that had been her sanctuary since the storm. Soon it would no longer be Ethan's room that she was borrowing, but their shared space, a thought that brought both nervousness and a strange sense of rightness. The evening before, after Lewis's departure, she and Ethan had talked late into the night, planning their next steps with the same careful deliberation they brought to all decisions. Lewis would attend their wedding as an additional witness, providing a legitimate reason for his presence in Willow Creek. Afterward, they would show him Daniel's evidence, and coordinate their approach to gathering further proof of Wells's current misdeeds. What they had not discussed was how Lewis's revelations might affect their marriage beyond its practical purposes. The knowledge that both Daniel and Elizabeth had been victims of Wells's deliberate actions, not just his general greed but his specific efforts to silence those who threatened him, had created a new bond between them, a shared grief and purpose that transcended their original arrangement. Rising from bed, Maggie moved to the window, testing her injured leg gingerly. The pain had subsided to a dull ache, and she could now walk short distances without the cane Ethan had made for her. Healing, like so many things, was a gradual process. Steps forward, occasional setbacks, but progress nonetheless. Outside, she could see Ethan already at work, splitting wood with powerful rhythmic swings of an axe. The morning light caught the silver at his temples and the steam of his breath in the cold air. There was something compelling about watching him work, the efficiency of his movements, the controlled strength, the total focus he brought to even this mundane task. Would she ever truly know this man she was about to marry? Could two people shaped by loss and driven by justice find their way to genuine happiness together? Maggie wasn't sure, but as she watched Ethan pause to wipe his brow, looking up toward the window where she stood, she felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. When he saw her at the window, he lifted a hand in greeting, a simple gesture, yet it carried a warmth that belied his usually reserved demeanor. Maggie raised her own hand in response, a smile forming unbidden on her lips. Yes, there was definitely hope. Sarah Brennan arrived shortly after breakfast, bringing with her not only her promised assistance with wedding preparations but also a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers tied with a blue ribbon. Every bride should have flowers, she declared, presenting them to Maggie with a warm smile, no matter how practical the reasons for the marriage. They're beautiful, Maggie said, genuinely touched by the thoughtful gesture. Thank you. Now then, Sarah continued briskly, let's get you ready. We don't have much time if we're to reach the church by noon. The next 2 hours passed in a flurry of activity as Sarah helped Maggie bathe, dress, and arrange her hair. The ivory wool dress they had fashioned the day before transformed her from an invalid in borrowed clothes to a bride of simple elegance. Sarah wove small white flowers into Maggie's dark hair, creating a natural crown that softened her features. There, Sarah said finally, stepping back to assess her handiwork. Ethan won't know what hit him. Looking in the small mirror, Maggie hardly recognized herself. Gone was the pale, haunted woman who had arrived half-drowned at Ethan's door. In her place stood someone stronger, more purposeful, a woman ready to begin a new chapter, however unexpected its origins. It's time, Sarah said, glancing out the window where Tom waited with the wagon that would transport them to town. Are you ready? Maggie took a deep breath, steadying herself against a momentary flutter of nerves. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Ethan was waiting outside, dressed in what was clearly his best clothing. A dark coat over a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly combed and his beard freshly trimmed. When Maggie emerged from the cabin, his expression changed in a way that sent warmth spreading through her chest. It wasn't just approval in his eyes, but something deeper, more personal. A look that made her feel truly seen. You look beautiful, he said simply, offering his arm to help her down the porch steps. Thank you, Maggie replied, her voice softer than she had intended. You look very handsome yourself. A hint of color touched Ethan's cheekbones at the compliment, endearing him to her further. This man who had faced battlefield horrors, who had rebuilt his life in solitude after devastating loss, could still blush at a simple compliment from his bride-to-be. The journey to town passed largely in silence, each of them absorbed in their own thoughts as the wagon bumped along the dirt road. Tom and Sarah rode up front, occasionally pointing out landmarks or commenting on the fine weather, their easy companionship a model of what marriage could be at its best. Willow Creek appeared much as Maggie remembered it, though the storm damage was still evident in missing roof shingles, downed branches, and the half-repaired schoolhouse that sent a pang through her heart as they passed. Would she ever teach there again? Or would Wells use his influence to ensure her dismissal regardless of her new marital status? As they approached the small white church at the edge of town, Maggie spotted Augustus Wells himself emerging from the bank across the street. He paused, watching their wagon with undisguised interest, his expression calculating as he noted her wedding attire and Ethan's formal clothing. "He knows," Maggie whispered, instinctively moving closer to Ethan on the wagon seat. "Somehow he knows what we're doing." Ethan followed her gaze, his jaw tightening as he observed Wells's scrutiny. "Let him know," he said quietly. "Our marriage is legitimate, whatever else it may accomplish." The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that steadied Maggie's suddenly racing heart. Yes, their union had practical purposes: protection from gossip, security against Wells's manipulations, a united front in pursuing justice. But beneath those considerations lay something genuine, a connection neither had anticipated, but both now valued. Reverend Phillips greeted them at the church door, his kind face showing none of the judgment Maggie had feared. "Miss Sullivan, Mr. Calloway," he said warmly, "I'm pleased to perform this ceremony for you, especially given the unusual circumstances that brought you together." "Thank you, Reverend," Ethan replied, his hand steady beneath Maggie's on his arm. "We appreciate your understanding." "The Lord works in mysterious ways," the Reverend said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes a storm is just a storm, and sometimes it's the hand of providence guiding two souls who need each other." Inside the church, James Lewis waited alongside the Brennans, his presence raising eyebrows among the few townspeople who had gathered to witness the unexpected wedding. Maggie recognized Mrs. Harrison among them, the town's primary gossip, clearly unable to resist the opportunity to observe firsthand what she had been speculating about for days. As they took their places before the altar, Ethan's hand found Maggie's, his fingers warm and reassuring against hers. She glanced up at him, finding his green eyes already on her face, steady and certain amid the swirl of complications surrounding them. Reverend Phillips's ceremony was simple but meaningful, emphasizing the sacred nature of marriage while acknowledging the practical partnership it represented, especially in frontier communities where survival often depended on mutual support and cooperation. When the time came for vows, Ethan's deep voice carried clearly through the small church. "I, Ethan James Calloway, take you, Margaret Ann Sullivan, to be my lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part." The traditional words took on new meaning given all they had already experienced together: Maggie's injury and fever, Ethan's care, their shared grief and purpose. They had already seen each other at their most vulnerable, already begun the work of supporting one another through difficulties. "I, Margaret Ann Sullivan," Maggie responded, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat, "take you, Ethan James Calloway, to be my lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do us part." As she spoke the words, Maggie realized they were not just a formality, but a genuine promise. Whatever had brought them to this moment, storm, injury, shared enemies, common purpose, she was committing herself to this man, to building a life with him that might begin in practicality, but could grow into something far more meaningful. The ring Ethan placed on her finger was a simple gold band purchased during his trip to town the day before. "With this ring, I thee wed," he said, sliding it onto her finger with gentle precision. "And with all my worldly goods, I thee endow." Those worldly goods now included her, his home, his ranch, his carefully built life of solitude that he was willingly transforming to include her. The generosity of it struck Maggie anew as the cool metal settled against her skin. "By the authority vested in me," Reverend Phillips concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He smiled at Ethan. "You may kiss your bride." This was the moment Maggie had both anticipated and dreaded. Their first kiss, performed not in private, but before witnesses, a seal on their covenant that would make the marriage truly binding in the eyes of those watching. Ethan's hand rose to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as he drew her closer. His eyes asked a silent question, giving her the opportunity to offer only the barest acknowledgement of the tradition. But as Maggie met his gaze, she found herself wanting more than a perfunctory gesture. Rising slightly on her toes, she closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a kiss that began as a simple affirmation, but quickly deepened into something neither had fully anticipated. Ethan's arms slipped on around her waist, steadying her as the contact between them awakened feelings long dormant in both. When they finally parted, Maggie was certain her flushed cheeks revealed more than she intended about her response to the kiss. But Ethan's expression, a mixture of surprise, wonder, and something that might have been desire, told her he had been equally affected by the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reverend Fildas announced, seemingly oblivious to the charged moment between the newly married couple, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Ethan Calloway." The small gathering offered polite applause, led enthusiastically by Sarah Brennan, whose knowing smile suggested she had observed more than Maggie might have wished. Even Mrs. Harrison seemed temporarily at a loss for criticism, her expression thoughtful as she studied the couple. As they turned to face their witnesses, Maggie noticed Augustus Wells standing at the back of the church, his unexpected presence casting a shadow over what should have been a moment of simple happiness. How long had he been there? What had he observed? The calculating look in his eyes suggested he was already assessing how this development might affect his own plans. Ethan noticed him as well, his arm tightening protectively around Maggie's waist. "Wells," he acknowledged with a curt nod. "Mr. and Mrs. Calloway, boss," Wells replied, his cultured voice carrying a note of amusement that set Maggie's teeth on edge. "What a charming ceremony. Please accept my congratulations on your hasty nuptials." The deliberate emphasis on hasty was not lost on anyone present. Wells was insinuating exactly what the wedding had been intended to counter, that impropriety had necessitated a quick marriage. "Thank you for your good wishes," Maggie replied before Ethan could speak, her tone pleasant but firm. "Though I would hardly call it hasty when Mr. Calloway and I have known each other for 3 years." It was a small deception, you see. They had indeed been acquainted if distantly during her time in Willow Creek, but one that effectively countered Wells's implication. From the slight narrowing of his eyes, Maggie could see the barb had landed. "Of course," Wells conceded smoothly. "How forgetful of me. Still, I'm surprised you didn't announce your engagement before now. Such happy news should be shared, don't you think?" "Some people prefer to keep their personal affairs private, Mr. Wells," Ethan responded, his voice level despite the tension Maggie could feel in his body. "Not everyone feels the need to publicize their intentions." The double meaning was clear to those who understood the fuller context, not just a reference to their supposed long-standing relationship, but a pointed comment on Wells's own carefully constructed public persona that hid his true nature and past. Wells's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed," he said, "privacy has its value, though in a small community like ours it's difficult to maintain for long." His gaze shifted to Lewis, standing quietly nearby. "I don't believe we've met, sir. Augustus Wells, chairman of the school board and owner of Willow Creek Bank." "James Lewis," the agent replied, offering his hand with apparent friendliness. "An old colleague of Dr. Calloway's. I was passing through the territory and heard of his wedding. Fortunate timing on my part." "Doctor," Wells repeated, his attention snapping back to Ethan. "I was under the impression Mr. Calloway was a rancher." "He is," Lewis confirmed. "But during the war, he was one of the finest surgeons in the Union Army. We served together in the medical corps." Something shifted in Wells' expression, a momentary calculation, a reassessment of potential threat. "How interesting," he said. "The war produced many unexpected careers. I myself supplied the Union Army with essential materials, a small contribution to the cause, but one I was proud to make." The audacity of the statement, to claim pride in the very activities that had caused so much suffering, sent a wave of cold anger through Maggie. Beside her, she felt Ethan go rigid, his control visibly strained by Wells's casual reference to his wartime profiteering. "Yes," Lewis agreed pleasantly, though Maggie could see the hard glint in his eyes. "The supply chains were crucial to the war effort. Some contracts were fulfilled admirably, others less so." Wells's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. "Indeed, war is a chaotic time. Inefficiencies are inevitable, regrettable though they may be." "Inefficiencies," Ethan repeated, the single word laden with suppressed fury. "Is that what you call it when soldiers die from infected wounds because the medicines provided were watered down? When surgical tools break during operations?" when bandages carry infection rather than preventing it. A tense silence fell over the church. Reverend Phillips looked bewildered by the sudden turn in conversation, while Mrs. Harrison and the other townspeople exchanged confused glances. Only the Brennans, aware of at least some of the context, and Lewis, who understood it fully, seemed unsurprised by Ethan's outburst. Wells recovered quickly, his expression shifting to one of concerned confusion. "Dr. Calloway, I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning. Surely you're not suggesting that I personally was responsible for such tragic outcomes?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Ethan replied, his voice cold with controlled rage. "I'm stating facts. Facts that can be proven with documentation and testimony." "On your wedding day? How extraordinary." Wells glanced around at the uncomfortable witnesses, his expression now one of sympathetic concern. "Perhaps the strain of recent events has affected you more than you realize, Dr. Calloway. First taking in Miss Sullivan, forgive me, Mrs. Calloway, under such unconventional circumstances, and now these unfounded accusations. It was masterfully done. The subtle reminder of the scandal, the implication of mental instability, the positioning of himself as the reasonable party confused by irrational attacks." Maggie could see several of the townspeople nodding slightly, already accepting Wells's interpretation of events. "I think that's enough excitement for one day," Lewis interjected smoothly. "Dr. and Mrs. Calloway have just been married. Perhaps further discussions could wait for a more appropriate time." "Of course," Wells agreed magnanimously. "My apologies for any distress. I merely came to offer my congratulations." He turned to Maggie with a slight bow. "Mrs. Calloway, I wish you every happiness in your new marriage. And as chairman of the school board, I look forward to discussing your continuing role at the school once repairs are completed." The implicit threat was clear. Her teaching position remained precarious, dependent on Wells's goodwill, regardless of her new marital status. But Maggie met his gaze steadily, refusing to show the fear he clearly hoped to inspire. "Thank you, Mr. Wells," she replied. "I look forward to that discussion as well. I'm sure the board will be interested in hearing about my ideas for expanding the curriculum to include more detailed study of recent history, including the war and its various supporting industries." Wells's eyes narrowed fractionally at the counter-threat. "Indeed," he said, "history is always instructive, though perspectives can vary widely on complex events." With a final nod to the gathering, he turned and left the church, his posture betraying none of the tension that had permeated the exchange. As the door closed behind him, Maggie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Ethan's arm tightened around her waist, offering silent support. "Well," Reverend Phillips said into the awkward silence, "perhaps we should move on to signing the marriage certificate, and then I believe Mrs. Brennan mentioned something about refreshments at the Calloway home to celebrate the occasion." The remainder of the formal proceedings passed quickly, with Ethan, Maggie, and their witnesses signing the document that officially recorded their union. As they prepared to depart, Mrs. Harrison approached, her expression uncharacteristically solemn. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, addressing Maggie by her new title with careful correctness, "I may have been hasty in my judgments regarding your situation. It seems there were circumstances I didn't fully understand." It was as close to an apology as the proud woman was likely to offer, and Maggie accepted it with grace. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. I appreciate your saying so." "That man, Wells," Mrs. Harrison continued, lowering her voice, "is it true what Dr. Calloway implied about his activities during the war?" "Yes," Maggie confirmed simply. "We have evidence." Mrs. Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "I never did trust him. Too smooth by half." She straightened her shoulders with sudden decision. "You can count on my support, Mrs. Calloway, both for your position at the school and whatever else may come." It was an unexpected alliance, but potentially a valuable one. Mrs. Harrison's gossip network might provide information they couldn't otherwise access, and her social influence could help counter Wells's carefully cultivated standing in the community. "Thank you," Maggie said again, with genuine gratitude this time. "That means a great deal." The journey back to the cabin, her home now, Maggie reminded herself, was subdued, the confrontation with Wells having cast a shadow over what should have been a day of simple celebration. Lewis rode with them in the wagon while the Brennans followed in their own conveyance, bringing the promised refreshments for the small wedding gathering. "He knows we're a threat," Lewis said quietly as they traveled. That display in the church was his way of assessing how much we know and how much evidence we might have. "He'll move against us now," Ethan agreed grimly. "The question is how and when." "We need to consolidate our evidence and develop a plan," Lewis replied. "The sooner we can present a complete case to the federal authorities, the safer you'll both be." Maggie listened to their tactical discussion, understanding the necessity, but also feeling a pang of regret that her wedding day had been so quickly subsumed by the larger conflict. She had not expected romance, certainly, but perhaps a few hours of simple happiness before returning to the grim business of justice seemed a small thing to wish for. As if sensing her thoughts, Ethan's hand found hers on the wagon seat, his fingers wrapping around hers in a gesture of quiet comfort. When she looked up at him, his expression held a warmth that belied his practical words to Lewis. "Today is still your wedding day," he said softly for her ears alone. "We'll deal with Wells, but not at the expense of acknowledging what we've begun together." The simple statement, so attuned to her unspoken feelings, touched Maggie deeply. This man who had been a stranger just days ago was already learning to read her moods, to understand her needs sometimes before she fully articulated them to herself. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing his hand in return, "for everything." The small celebration at the cabin was a modest affair, but genuinely warm. Sarah had prepared a simple but delicious meal, and Tom had brought a bottle of good whiskey to toast the newlyweds. For a few hours, they managed to set aside the looming confrontation with Wells and simply enjoy the company of the small circle who knew the truth of their situation and supported them regardless. As afternoon mellowed into evening, the Brennans prepared to depart, leaving Lewis to continue discussions with Ethan and Maggie about their next steps. "Thank you both," Maggie said, embracing Sarah warmly, "for standing with us, for understanding." "That's what neighbors do," Tom replied simply. "Besides, if what you say about Wells is true, he's a threat to the whole community, not just you two." "We'll be in touch soon," Ethan promised, shaking Tom's hand. "And if you notice anything unusual, Wells meeting with strangers, unexpected activities at the bank, let us know immediately." After the Brennans departed, Lewis, Ethan, and Maggie gathered around the dining table where Daniel's evidence lay spread out alongside Ethan's medical journal and the additional documentation Lewis had brought with him. Together, they created a comprehensive picture of Wells's wartime activities, the fraudulent contracts, the substandard supplies, the profits gained at the expense of soldiers' lives. "This is more than enough for an indictment," Lewis confirmed, surveying the assembled evidence with satisfaction. "The challenge now is connecting it to his current activities in Willow Creek. We need to prove he's continuing his pattern of fraud and manipulation." "The loan documents Tom mentioned," Maggie suggested. "If Wells is using predatory lending practices to acquire property, that could be one avenue." "And the widow Carlton's land," Ethan added. "Sarah said Wells has been courting her, presumably to gain control of her property. If he's misrepresenting the value or his intentions—" "Both worth investigating," Lewis agreed. "But we need to move carefully. After today's confrontation, Wells will be watching for any unusual activities." The discussion continued as darkness fell, with plans being formulated, contingencies considered, and responsibilities assigned. By the time they had finished, the hour was late, and Lewis rose to return to his room in town. "I'll begin making discreet inquiries tomorrow," he said as Ethan saw him to the door. "The sooner we can complete our case, the better for everyone." After Lewis's departure, Maggie began clearing away the remains of their meal and the papers they had been reviewing. The simple domestic task gave her hands something to do while her mind processed the day's events: the wedding, the confrontation with Wells, the planning session that had followed. Only now, in the quiet aftermath, did the reality of her new situation fully register. She was married. This cabin was her home. The man watching her from across the room was her husband, with all the implications that carried. "You must be tired," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "It's been a long day." "Yes," Maggie agreed, though in truth she felt more alert than exhausted, her nerves humming with awareness of their changed circumstances. An awkward silence fell between them, the first since their acquaintance began. The practicalities that had carried them through the past days seemed suddenly inadequate, in the face of this new intimacy they had legally, if not yet physically, entered into. "I've been thinking," Ethan began, his voice carefully neutral, "about sleeping arrangements." Maggie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "Yes? I meant what I said before, that I wouldn't expect or demand the physical aspects of marriage unless—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "Unless such feelings develop naturally between us." "I remember," Maggie said softly, "but appearances are important, especially now that Wells is suspicious of our motives." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of uncertainty from a man usually so composed. "If anyone were to visit unexpectedly, separate sleeping arrangements might raise questions about the legitimacy of our marriage." It was a practical consideration, logically presented, yet Maggie sensed there was more behind his words than mere concern for appearances. The memory of their wedding kiss, brief but unexpectedly affecting, hung between them, an acknowledgement that whatever had begun as practical necessity was evolving into something more complex. "You're suggesting we share the bedroom," she said, keeping her voice as steady as his. "Yes." Ethan met her gaze directly. "I can make a pallet on the floor for myself. You would have the bed, as before." The offer was considerate, respecting her comfort while addressing the practical concern he had raised. Yet Maggie found herself oddly disappointed by it, as if some part of her had been hoping for a different suggestion entirely. "That seems unnecessary," she heard herself saying. "The bed is large enough for both of us, and you've already spent too many nights sleeping in discomfort because of me." Surprise flickered across Ethan's face, followed by something warmer. "You're certain?" Maggie nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. Then gathering her courage, she added, "We're adults, Ethan. We can share a bed without expectations. But I don't want to begin our marriage with you sleeping on the floor as if you were merely a guest in your own home." The word marriage hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. This was no longer a theoretical arrangement or a future event, but their present reality, a covenant they had entered into together, for whatever mixture of practical and personal reasons had brought them to this moment. "Thank you," Ethan said finally, "for your understanding and for—" He gestured vaguely, encompassing the cabin, the day, perhaps their entire unlikely journey together. "For all of this." "I should be thanking you," Maggie replied. "You opened your home to a half-drowned stranger, cared for me when I was injured, and offered me protection when my reputation and safety were threatened. Sharing your bed seems a small concession in return." Something shifted in Ethan's expression at her words, a subtle darkening of his eyes, a tension around his mouth that suggested her choice of phrase had affected him more than she had intended. Maggie felt an answering warmth spread through her body, a heightened awareness of him not as her rescuer or protector, but as a man, one who had kissed her with unexpected gentleness just hours before. "It's late," she said, her voice softer than she had intended. "Perhaps we should retire." The bedtime routine they established that night would become familiar in the days that followed, taking turns in the small washroom, Ethan banking the fire while Maggie turned down the bed, each careful to afford the other privacy while changing into nightclothes. When they finally lay side by side, a careful distance maintained between them, despite the shared quilt, Maggie found herself acutely aware of Ethan's presence. The sound of his breathing, the warmth radiating from his body, the faint scent of soap and something uniquely him that she had come to associate with safety and comfort. "Good night, Margaret," he said quietly, his deep voice seeming more intimate in the darkness. "Good night, Ethan," she replied, equally soft. Then after a moment's hesitation, she added, "I'm glad I married you." The simple statement, offered without qualification or explanation, hung in the darkness between them. For a long moment, Ethan was silent, and Maggie wondered if she had overstepped some boundary neither had explicitly defined. Then his hand found hers beneath the quilt, his fingers warm and strong as they curled around hers. "I'm glad you married me too," he said, the words carrying a weight of sincerity that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. They fell asleep that way, hands joined beneath the covers, a small but significant connection that bridged the careful distance they maintained otherwise. It was, Maggie thought as she drifted towards sleep, a beginning of sorts, not just of their marriage, but of something neither had anticipated when practical necessity had first brought them together. The days that followed established a new rhythm to their lives, a domestic partnership by day, a careful negotiation of shared space by night, and throughout a growing awareness of each other that neither openly acknowledged but both increasingly felt. Lewis became a frequent visitor, bringing updates on his investigation into Wells's activities in Willow Creek. The picture that emerged was troubling, a systematic effort to acquire property and influence throughout the town, with the apparent goal of controlling the route of the proposed railroad extension. He's positioning himself to profit enormously when the railroad announces its plans, Lewis explained one evening as they gathered around the dining table. The land he's acquiring, through loans, through courting the widow Carleton, through purchase of tax liens, it all falls along the most likely route for the tracks. How is that illegal? Maggie asked. Unethical, certainly, but not necessarily criminal. It becomes criminal when fraud is involved, Lewis replied. And I've found evidence that Wells has been using his position at the bank to manipulate loan terms, falsify property valuations, and pressure vulnerable landowners into selling at below-market rates. Can you prove it? Ethan asked, his expression grim. Lewis hesitated. Not yet, not conclusively. I need access to the bank's records. The real ones, not the versions Wells shows to his board of directors. How would we get those? Maggie wondered. The bank is always occupied during business hours, and at night it's securely locked. A heavy silence fell over the table as the implication became clear. Someone would need to enter the bank illegally to obtain the necessary evidence. No, Ethan said firmly, reading Maggie's expression. Absolutely not. It's too dangerous. I wasn't suggesting, she began, but he cut her off. You were, I could see it in your face. His tone softened slightly. Margaret, Wells already suspects us. If you were caught breaking into the bank, he would have the perfect excuse to have you arrested. Or worse. Ethan's right, Lewis agreed. Besides, this requires someone with experience in acquiring sensitive materials discreetly. You mean a thief? Maggie translated bluntly. Lewis smiled thinly. I was thinking more of someone with military reconnaissance training, like myself. It's still too risky, Ethan insisted. Wells may have security measures we're not aware of, which is why I need information about the bank's layout, security protocols, and Wells's personal habits before I make any attempt, Lewis countered. Information that Mrs. Calloway, as a respected teacher in the community, might be able to gather through ordinary social interaction without raising suspicion. Maggie considered this approach. It was certainly less dangerous than attempting to break in herself, yet still allowed her to contribute meaningfully to their investigation. I could do that, she agreed. Several of my students' parents work at the bank or have regular business there. And with the school repairs nearly complete, I'll need to visit town more frequently anyway. Ethan looked unhappy with the plan, but didn't object further. You'll be careful, he said, not a question, but a condition of his reluctant acceptance. Of course, Maggie assured him, touched by his concern. I'll simply be a teacher checking on the progress of repairs and a new bride making ordinary purchases for her household. Nothing suspicious about either role. The plan set in motion, their days took on new purpose. Maggie began making regular trips to town, establishing a visible presence that would make her later, more focused information gathering less noticeable. Ethan continued his ranch work while maintaining contact with Tom Brennan, who kept watch on Wells's movements and visitors. Lewis divided his time between discreet inquiries in town and coordinating with his superiors through carefully coded telegrams. Throughout it all, Maggie and Ethan's relationship continued its gradual evolution. The careful distance they maintained in bed slowly diminished, until one night Maggie woke to find herself curled against Ethan's side, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Neither mentioned it the next morning, but that night they fell asleep closer together, and within a week, the embrace had become their natural sleeping position. Their days, too, saw a softening of boundaries. Ethan began teaching Maggie about the ranch operations, explaining his breeding program for the cattle and his plans for expanding the operation. Maggie shared her teaching methods and her hopes for the school once it reopened. They played chess in the evenings, read aloud from Ethan's collection of books, and gradually filled the silence that had once dominated the cabin with conversation and quiet laughter. It was domestic tranquility of a sort neither had experienced before, not just the practical partnership they had agreed to, but a genuine meeting of minds and increasingly hearts. The kiss they had shared at their wedding remained unrepeated, yet the possibility of more hung in the air between them, a tension that built slowly but steadily as autumn deepened toward winter. Then came the day that shattered their fragile peace. Maggie had gone to town alone, as she often did now that her leg had fully healed, to check on the schoolhouse repairs and gather information about the bank's routine. The work on the school was nearly complete, with classes scheduled to resume the following week. The school board had not yet made a formal decision about her continued employment, but Reverend Phillips had assured her privately that support was leaning in her favor, despite Wells's opposition. As she was leaving the schoolhouse, a messenger boy approached her with an envelope. "Mrs. Calloway?" he asked. "This is for you, from Mr. Wells." Puzzled, Maggie accepted the envelope and opened it to find a brief note in Wells's elegant handwriting. "Mrs. Calloway, I have information regarding your late fiancé, Daniel Winters, that I believe you will find most interesting. Please call at my office at your earliest convenience. I assure you this matter is of the utmost importance to both of us. Respectfully, Augustus Wells." Maggie stared at the note, her heart racing. How had Wells made the connection to Daniel? She had been careful never to use his surname in Willow Creek, had changed her own name slightly when moving west, had kept their relationship private, unless he had known all along, had been watching her for years, aware of who she was and what she might know about his wartime activities. The thought sent a chill down her spine. Her first instinct was to return immediately to the ranch, to show the note to Ethan and Lewis and develop a plan together. But something made her hesitate. If Wells truly had information about Daniel, perhaps evidence that might strengthen their case against him, this might be their best opportunity to obtain it. And if it was a trap, well, they were in a public building in the middle of the day. What could he possibly do to her that wouldn't be witnessed by dozens of people? Decision made, Maggie crossed the street to the bank, nodding politely to acquaintances she passed along the way. Inside, the teller directed her to Wells's private office at the rear of the building, his expression suggesting such a summons was unusual but not unprecedented. Wells rose from behind his desk as she entered, the picture of gentlemanly courtesy. "Mrs. Calloway," he greeted her. "Thank you for coming so promptly. Please have a seat." Maggie remained standing, maintaining what she hoped was a polite but cautious demeanor. "Your note mentioned information about my late fiancé," she said, dispensing with pleasantries. "What exactly do you know about Daniel Winters?" A thin smile crossed Wells's face at her directness. "Quite a lot, actually, including the fact that he was treated by your current husband before his untimely death at Gettysburg." He gestured again to the chair opposite his desk. "Please sit. This conversation may take some time." Reluctantly, Maggie took the offered seat, her mind racing. How much did Wells know? And more importantly, what was his purpose in revealing that knowledge now? "I've been aware of your connection to Private Winters for some time, Mrs. Calloway," Wells continued once she was seated. "Just as I've been aware of your possession of certain documents he entrusted to you before his death." Maggie kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said evenly. Wells's smile widened slightly. "Come now, Mrs. Calloway. There's no need for pretense between us. You have evidence you believe implicates me in providing substandard supplies to the Union Army. Evidence you've now shared with your husband and your mysterious visitor, Mr. Lewis, who is, I strongly suspect, an agent of the War Department." The casual revelation of how much he knew stunned Maggie into momentary silence. Wells had been watching them more closely than they had imagined, gathering information even as they worked to build their case against him. "What do you want?" she asked finally, seeing no point in continuing to deny what he clearly already knew. "A simple exchange," Wells replied. "Your evidence, all copies and originals, for this." He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a folded document, which he slid across the surface toward her. Maggie hesitated, then picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was a deed to the schoolhouse and the land it occupied, made out to the Willow Creek School District in perpetuity. "I don't understand," Maggie said, genuinely confused. "You're offering to deed the school property to the district?" Brain, as a gesture of goodwill, Wells replied smoothly, and to secure your position as teacher, which I will fully support before the board at our next meeting. In exchange, you and your husband will cease your investigation into my past activities and turn over all evidence in your possession. Maggie stared at the document, understanding dawning. You're trying to buy us off. I prefer to think of it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, Wells corrected. You regain your position and secure the school's future. I am free from the inconvenience of defending myself against historical allegations that would be difficult to prove in court regardless. It was tempting, more tempting than Maggie wanted to admit. The school had been her purpose, her refuge, her connection to a community that had become home over the past 3 years. To secure it permanently, to know her students would have a place to learn regardless of future property disputes or railroad plans. It was a powerful inducement, but the cost was too high. Daniel's evidence, Elizabeth's memory, justice for the countless soldiers who had suffered because of Wells's greed. How could she trade all that for her own security and comfort? No, she said firmly, placing the deed back on the desk. I won't be bought, Mr. Wells, and neither will my husband. Wells's expression hardened, the veneer of polite negotiation falling away. You should reconsider, Mrs. Calloway. This offer is generous, far more so than you deserve, given the trouble you've caused me. If you refuse, I cannot guarantee your continued safety or position in this community. Is that a threat? Maggie asked, rising from her chair, unwilling to remain seated while he loomed over her. A prediction, Wells corrected, based on a realistic assessment of your situation. You have no influential connections here. Your reputation has already been compromised by your unorthodox living arrangements before your hasty marriage. And the evidence you possess, while potentially damaging, would be your word against mine in any legal proceeding. Not just my word, Maggie countered. Dr. Calloway's medical records corroborate the pattern of substandard supplies. And Mr. Lewis has gathered additional testimony from other officers who served during the war. Something flickered in Wells's eyes, a momentary uncertainty that told Maggie her words had found their mark. He hadn't known how extensive their evidence had become. Nevertheless, he continued, recovering quickly, such cases are difficult to prove after so many years. Memories fade, documents can be questioned, and in the meantime, your life here would become increasingly uncomfortable. I won't be intimidated, Mr. Wells. Maggie straightened her shoulders, drawing on a strength she hadn't known she possessed before the storm that had changed her life. And I won't betray the memory of those who died because of your greed, including my fiancé. Wells studied her for a long moment, his expression calculating. Your loyalty to a dead man is admirable, if misguided, he said finally. But what of your loyalty to the living, to your students, to the community that has given you a home, even to your new husband, who risks everything by standing with you in this foolish crusade? The question struck at Maggie's deepest doubts, the conflict between her desire for justice and her responsibilities to those who depended on her now. Was she right to pursue Wells at such potential cost to herself and others? Justice serves everyone, she said, voicing the conclusion she had reached through her internal struggle, including my students, who deserve to grow up in a community where truth matters more than profit, including my husband, who lost someone he loved to the same greed that killed Daniel, and including you, Mr. Wells, whether you recognize it or not. Wells's expression hardened into cold anger. You've made your choice then. Remember that, in the days to come. He returned the deed to his drawer with deliberate movements. I offered you a way out, a chance to secure your future and put the past behind you. You chose differently. Whatever follows is on your head, not mine. The threat, for it was unmistakably that despite his careful phrasing, hung in the air between them. Maggie felt a chill of genuine fear, but refused to show it, maintaining her composure as she turned to leave. One last thing, Mrs. Calloway, Wells called as she reached the door. Ask your husband about triage sometime, about how he decided which soldiers deserved treatment and which were left to die. You might find his answers illuminating. The parting shot hit its mark, planting a seed of doubt that Wells clearly hoped would divide her from Ethan at this critical juncture. But Maggie had seen Ethan's medical journals, had read his anguished notes about the impossible choices forced upon him by supply shortages. If Wells thought to turn her against her husband with such insinuations, he had severely misjudged the trust that had grown between them. Without dignifying the comment with a response, Maggie left the bank, her mind racing with the implications of the encounter. Wells had shown his hand more clearly than ever before. His knowledge of their investigation, his willingness to use bribery and threats, his desperate desire to suppress the evidence they had gathered. But in doing so, he had also revealed his vulnerability. The offer of the school deed suggested he was genuinely concerned about their case against him. The flash of uncertainty when she mentioned their corroborating evidence indicated he hadn't realized how strong their position had become. They were close, closer than Wells was comfortable with, and that made him dangerous in ways they needed to prepare for immediately. Maggie hurried back to the ranch, grateful for the horse Ethan had insisted she use for her trips to town. The faster she could share this development with him and Lewis, the sooner they could adjust their plans accordingly. She found them in the main room of the cabin, heads bent over maps and documents spread across the dining table. Both looked up sharply at her breathless entrance. "Margaret, what's happened?" Ethan was on his feet immediately, crossing to her with concern evident in his face. "Wells knows," she said without preamble. "About Daniel, about our evidence, about Lewis's real purpose here. He tried to buy me off with a deed to the school property in exchange for dropping our investigation." Lewis swore under his breath, an uncharacteristic break in his usual composure. "How much does he know about our current evidence? Our plans?" "I'm not sure," Maggie admitted, allowing Ethan to guide her to a chair. "But he knew enough to be worried. He made threats when I refused his offer." "What kind of threats?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Maggie related the entire conversation, including Wells's parting comment about triage decisions. As she had expected, this last attempt to sow discord between them only strengthened Ethan's resolve. "He's desperate," Lewis observed when she had finished. "Offering the school deed is a significant concession. He must believe our case is stronger than we thought. Or he's planning something more drastic and wanted to give himself a legal alternative if you refused," Ethan countered grimly. "Either way, we need to move now before he can act against us." "The bank records," Lewis agreed. "If he's been watching us this closely, he may already be destroying evidence. I'll need to get in there tonight." "It's too dangerous," Ethan objected. "If he's expecting someone to try accessing his records, he'll have additional security in place." "We don't have a choice," Lewis insisted. "This may be our only opportunity before he completely covers his tracks." As the two men debated strategy, Maggie's attention was drawn to movement outside the window. A rider approaching at speed down the road from town. "Someone's coming," she interrupted, rising to get a better view. Ethan joined her at the window, his body tense with alertness. "It's Tom Brennan," he identified the rider, "and he's riding hard." They met Tom at the door, his horse lathered from the pace he had set and his expression grave. "Wells is moving against you," he said without preamble. "He's filed charges with the sheriff, fraud and conspiracy against the federal government. Claims you've been falsifying evidence to blackmail him." "That's absurd," Maggie protested. "We have genuine documents. Testimony doesn't matter," Tom cut her off. "Sheriff's deputized half a dozen men. They're on their way here now to arrest both of you and seize all papers in your possession. Lewis, too, if they find him here." Ethan's expression hardened into decisive calm. "How much time do we have?" "An hour, maybe less," Tom replied. "I rode ahead as soon as I heard, but they were already gathering when I left town." Lewis was already moving, gathering the most crucial documents from the table. "We need to secure the evidence somewhere Wells and the sheriff can't find it," he said. "Then decide whether to stand and fight these false charges or withdraw temporarily until I can contact my superiors for official support." "The evidence goes with you," Ethan decided, helping collect the papers. "Get it to the federal authorities in Denver. Margaret and I will deal with the sheriff here." "And say what?" Maggie asked, already helping to organize the documents. "Wells has turned everything around, making us look like the criminals." "We tell the truth," Ethan replied simply, "and trust that eventually justice will prevail. But the evidence is what matters most. Without it, Wells walks free, regardless of what happens to us." The logic was sound, if difficult to accept. They worked quickly, assembling the most damning evidence for Lewis to take while keeping enough legitimate documents to support their own defense if arrested. Within 20 minutes, Lewis was ready to depart through the back of the property, taking a route that would avoid the approaching sheriff's posse. "I'll send word as soon as I reach Denver," he promised. "3 days, 4 at most. Can you hold out that long?" "We'll manage," Ethan assured him, though Maggie could see the concern beneath his confident demeanor. "Just get that evidence to people who can act on it officially." As Lewis disappeared into the gathering dusk, Maggie turned to Ethan, suddenly aware that they might have very little time left together before being separated by arrest and imprisonment. "What now?" she asked softly. Ethan's hand found hers, his fingers warm and strong against her skin. "Now we prepare to face whatever comes," he said, "together." The word carried a weight of meaning beyond their current crisis. A promise, a commitment, a declaration of something neither had fully articulated, but both increasingly felt. Whatever Wells might do to them legally, whatever separation might be forced upon them in the coming days, they were bound by more than just the practical arrangement that had begun their marriage. Tom Brennan departed shortly after Lewis, promising to spread word of Wells's actions and rally community support for the Callaways. Left alone, Maggie and Ethan spent their remaining time putting the cabin in order, ensuring nothing incriminating remained for the sheriff to find, and preparing themselves mentally for what was to come. As the sound of approaching horses reached them, Ethan drew Maggie into his arms, holding her close for a moment that felt both eternal and far too brief. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "know that marrying you was the best decision I've made since coming west. Storm or no storm." Maggie looked up at him, seeing in his green eyes all the things they hadn't yet had time to say to each other. "And accepting your proposal was the best decision I've made," she replied. "I don't regret a moment of it." His lips found hers in a kiss that held none of the hesitation of their wedding day, a kiss of certainty and promise, of feelings too long restrained now finally acknowledged. It was brief but profound, a declaration and a pledge in one. Then they separated, straightening their clothing and composing their expressions as the sheriff's party arrived in the yard. Together they went to meet whatever came next, not just as allies in a cause, but as partners in the truest sense, bound by choice and circumstance and the love that had grown between them despite all odds. The storm that had brought them together had passed, but its effects would endure. In the shelter they had found in each other, in the strength they had discovered together, and in the justice they would ultimately secure. Not just for those they had lost, but for the future they were determined to build together. As they stepped onto the porch to face the approaching sheriff, Ethan's hand found Maggie's once more, their fingers intertwining in silent affirmation. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced all others since that fateful night, together in the shelter they had created within the storm.